The merchant adjusted his hat, squinting against the early morning sun as he watched the last of his cargo being loaded onto the wagon. Thick rolls of fabric, prized imports from the southern provinces, lay neatly stacked, their vibrant patterns hidden under protective canvas. He ran a hand over the edge of the wagon, ensuring the ropes were securely tied. His fingers brushed against the coarse texture of the covering to check for any oddities. Did that part always stick out like that? He noticed an oddity there, a little bit of the white fabric was sticking out. He leaned over in an attempt to check, but right as he did, a voice from behind him resounded. "Are you finished? We need to leave, we are already behind schedule." Yeah, everything is fine." The man nodded and leaned away from the wagon where the fabric rolls were packed. With one last glance at the odd protrusion, he decided it wasn't worth delaying further inspection. Satisfied that the cargo was secure, he adjusted his hat once more and waved to the coachman. "All right, let's get moving." The convoy began to rumble forward, the heavy wagons creaking as they rolled onto the cobblestone streets. Everything seemed in order, yet a persistent unease gnawed at him. The city had been in chaos since the battle with the cultists last night. Word spread fast, even among those who kept their heads down. Now that a strange cult had been exposed in this city, the merchants wished to do nothing more than to get out. They knew that once the Galini believers entered the city, it was bad for business. "Do you think they will let us through?" "I hope so, we should still make it, but it might be close." Two of the merchants had a discussion as their wagons filled with wares rolled forward. They knew that these paladins would start searching every store and every part of the city for signs of this cult. The marketplace would probably be closed and some of their wares could be confiscated due to these zealots, some of them who were corrupt. It was best to quickly leave the city and return later once things had settled and these people had left. "Then we should hurry, do you have it?" "Yeah." The man nodded, showing off a large sack to the other merchant. The clang of coins resonated as he shook it. Unbeknownst to them, the fabrics in the rear wagon began to shift. Nestled safely beneath the rolls of fabric was a silvery white ant. She was not alone, beside her lay a small metal helmet and a darkened orb of light. "Lady Gleam, it would be better if you stayed still," Rusty whispered. "Is it that uncomfortable?" "Sorry, Gleam, but we have to stay quiet for now. Once we're outside the gates, we'll have a chance to flee." "That's my Gleam." Rusty encouraged his companion, who was clearly struggling with the bumpy ride. The streets were paved with rough stones, making the wagon lurch and rattle as it moved. It was far from a smooth journey. Despite the discomfort, they needed to remain calm. If anyone discovered they were hiding among the merchants' wares, it would spell disaster. Rusty, now without a proper adventurer's body to inhabit, relied entirely on this escape plan. The plan was simple: stay concealed within the merchants' goods and wait for the right moment to make their move. If all went well, they would escape together once they were safely beyond the city gates. The merchants' convoy trundled along the cobbled streets, making its way toward the towering city gates. The sunlight was climbing higher, casting long shadows across the bustling thoroughfare. Around them, the city seemed tense, with citizens speaking in hushed tones and guards patrolling in pairs. Word of the cultist battle had spread like wildfire, and the looming presence of the paladins of Galini only added to the unease. Rusty, snugly nestled alongside Gleam beneath the tightly packed rolls of fabric, activated his life detection skill once more. It was faint at this distance, but it allowed him to sense movement outside their wagon, a subtle precaution as they neared the gates. The convoy slowed, and the distinct clink of armor grew louder. The guards stationed at the city gates were stopping each wagon for inspection. Their stern voices carried through the air as they ordered the merchants to halt. "All vehicles are subject to inspection," barked one of the guards, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. Inside their wagon, Rusty felt Gleam twitch nervously. Her tiny antennae brushed against the fabric surrounding them, conveying her unease. He didn't understand fear too much as he was still only a piece of armor, but after using the possession skill and interacting with humans, he was quickly learning. Rusty's attention was divided between the people bustling around the gate and his SP count. Enough time had passed since their arrival for him to switch to a new loadout, if necessary. While he could fight if it came to that, he knew it wouldn't be the best idea. The priority was to remain unnoticed. If worst came to worst, perhaps Gleam could escape on her own while he pretended to be nothing more than a small, ant-shaped helmet. "Stay calm, Gleam. Everything will be fine," Rusty whispered reassuringly, but he wondered if they would truly be fine. "Oh. Listen to Rusty, Lady Gleam, even if they discover you, they're unlikely to associate you with those madmen. You're just an ant, and Rusty's just a helmet. They might even assume you're part of the merchant's wares. Aberden's tone was oddly gentle. Rusty suspected it was more out of self-preservation than genuine concern. If Gleam started trembling and drew attention, they'd all be discovered, and Aberden would share in their fate. Rusty knew the Demon King was only on his side because their lives were bound together. If Gleam were caught, Rusty would have no choice but to fight, and that was the last thing Aberden wanted. For now, staying hidden and calm was the only path to survival. Rusty could hear the murmurs of other merchants as they nervously handed over documents and coins, hoping to expedite the process. The clinking of armor drew closer, and Rusty activated his life detection skill again. One guard lingered near their wagon longer than the others. "What's in here?" the guard asked, his voice gruff and filled with suspicion. "Just textiles, sir," the merchant replied, trying to keep his tone even. "High-quality imports from the south. See for yourself." Rusty's metaphorical heart sank as he felt the guard's weight press against the side of the wagon. The canvas covering rustled as the guard untied a corner to peek inside. Gleam froze, her tiny body pressing deeper into the folds of fabric. "Don't move, Gleam. Humans require their eyes to see, even if they touch you, just stay still." Rusty called out softly in a way only Gleam could hear. Meanwhile, the guard's hand reached into the wagon, brushing against the fabric rolls. His fingers lingered dangerously close to Gleam's hiding spot, and for an agonizing moment, Rusty braced for the worst. If the guard pulled her out, their entire plan would crumble. Rusty's mind raced, formulating contingencies. If the man grabbed Gleam, he would immediately activate his loadout. Appearing in his largest form would likely stun the guards, giving him just enough time to grab Gleam and run. He already knew the layout as this gate led to the F-rank dungeon where he had first emerged from. The city was encircled by a moat, meaning he would have to cross the bridge. He doubted the guards would let him escape without a chase, but he had a plan. In the chaos, he could launch Gleam into the safety of nearby bushes along with his helmet. From there, he would use his headless body as a decoy while his core and Gleam made their escape. It was a simple, desperate plan, but it was all he had. Thankfully, it didn't come to that. After a tense moment, the guard withdrew his hand, leaving Gleam untouched. Rusty allowed himself a silent sigh of relief, knowing they had narrowly avoided disaster, at least, for now. "Looks fine to me," the guard muttered while stepping back. "Move along." The merchant exhaled and lowered his head at the guard. "Thank you, officer. Safe travels to you." As the wagon began to roll forward again, Rusty felt a wave of relief wash over him. Gleam let out a tiny chirp of joy, her antennae quivering with excitement. "Well done, Lady Gleam," Aberden murmured. "You've nerves of steel for such a small creature." _ "Why, you hurt me, Lady Gleam, that you would accuse me of sarcasm." Gleam seemed perceptive enough to sense Aberden's true inclinations, but now wasn't the time to dwell on it. The convoy creaked onwards, its wheels groaning under the weight of merchant goods. Rusty remained vigilant, relying on his limited-range life detection skill to keep track of everyone nearby. The caravan comprised 3 carts filled with merchant goods, along with several other carriages. While there were plenty of people present, most of them didn't appear battle-ready. This was a truth Rusty had only recently begun to grasp. Previously, he had assumed that the people of this world were more like adventurers, strong and willing to risk their lives in combat. However, the reality was different. Most of the population wasn't much stronger than an average F-rank monster. Many were part of the civilian class, with roles such as villager or farmer, classes seemingly assigned to them at random. Around the age of 10, people in this world could visit a nearby shrine where they would be assigned a class that would shape their future. Unlike monsters, who were inherently born for battle, these people had other purposes. Some were suited for crafting items, while others focused on farming or producing goods to trade and sell. Rusty still didn't fully understand the intricacies of this system, but one thing was clear, the majority of these people posed no threat to him or Gleam. While this knowledge offered a small measure of reassurance, it didn't lessen Rusty's vigilance. His focus remained on the convoy, ever watchful for any signs of danger. For now, at least, their presence went unnoticed. The convoy finally passed through the city gates, and the bustling noise of the city began to fade. Beyond the walls lay the open road, flanked by fields and sparse clusters of trees. The merchants sighed in relief, their conversations shifting to lighter topics now that they were out of the guard's reach. The harvest has been thinning lately. I wonder if the gods are angry. Perhaps, but luckily there are other ways we can earn our keep. That's true. Not every city has 3 dungeons nearby. We can sell all these monster materials and even those textiles. Rusty overheard the 2 merchants discussing business and started to wonder when the best time would be to make his move. While he couldn't see much around him except for Gleam and the fabric rolls, it was clear they were moving farther and farther from the city. The wagon he was in remained empty of other living beings, so he decided it was time to summon his second guide, Alexander. The familiar white orb of light appeared beside him, and with it, they could finally discuss their next steps. Why isn't it the useless hero? Aberdan sneered. Shut it. Aberdan wasted no time mocking Alexander for his absence during the fight with the cultists. Why should I? But perhaps it's for the best. Some of your friends showed up. That priestess of Galini was there, wasn't she? Alexander fell silent, as if unwilling to answer the question. Rusty wasn't sure what was going on there, but it didn't seem important. What mattered now was figuring out what he should do next. He had escaped the dungeon of his birth and left the city behind. The world was starting to open up to him, but he wasn't sure how to survive in it. He needed to focus on his options, and he hoped that Alexander and Aberdan might have some ideas. Yeah, they still argue the same as they did before. I've gotten used to it. Rusty answered Gleam while the 2 listened to the 2 bicker like an old married couple again. Quiet down you 2, I need your help. He finally gave the order, and the 2 guides fell silent immediately. Rusty had accomplished several of his goals so far. The first was breaking free from the dungeon, which he had managed over a month ago. The second was rescuing Gleam, which was now nearly complete. They just needed to escape the merchant convoy, and then they would be in the clear. But that was where things stalled as he wasn't sure what his next goal should be. Where should I go? What should I do? Oh, quite the existential question there, Rusty. Aberdan answered in the usual mocking tone. Rusty sighed metaphorically, wishing he could roll his non-existent eyes. I'm serious. We're out of the city, and for now, we're safe. But... Rusty tried to continue but Alexander quickly interrupted him. But you are afraid that something bad will happen in the future if you just aimlessly set out into the wide open world. Something like that. He had been born a monster, something that should have remained in a dungeon, bound to its dark confines. But now he was free, and the world seemed to be his oyster, a very terrifying oyster. Rusty had believed himself to be relatively strong compared to the average adventurer. He had aced the tests and even managed to kill monsters like orcs. However, after encountering that one mage, and later, the high priest, he wasn't so sure he was ready to face the great unknown. There were forces in this world that could crush him like a bug. If he and Gleam were to survive and thrive, they needed to grow stronger before challenging such powerful beings. And yet, despite the fear, a part of him yearned for those battles. Or perhaps he's contemplating his life? Aberdan asked, breaking the silence. My life? Why, yes. You are now free of the shackles that once bound you. Ready to set out and conquer the world. Aberdan declared with an almost theatrical flourish. Conquer the world. Indeed. You must set your sights high, my dear Rusty. Why not aspire to become the next Demon King? With my help, you could easily bring the demonic dukes under your control. And this time... Aberdan began cackling like the villain he once was. Despite the grandiosity of his words, there was an undeniable truth to them. Rusty felt it too, an unquenchable yearning to experience all that this world had to offer. He wanted to push himself, to use every ounce of his skill, and to challenge the truly powerful forces that roamed this land. There was so much he longed to do, so much he ached to see, that the fear of the open world that had once gripped him began to fade. In its place, a growing sense of excitement and hunger took root, a yearning for the boundless possibilities ahead. You want Rusty to fight a demonic duke? I thought you were mad, but this is outright idiotic. He has to aim big. With those fascinating abilities he has, and the Soul Forge, it will be possible. You just want him to take your revenge on the dukes who betrayed you. Alexander interjected sharply, his voice, as always, tinged with annoyance. Don't think I don't see through your ploy, Aberdan. You're trying to convince Rusty to fight your battles for you. Aberdan chuckled, and if he hadn't been just an orb of light, the sound would have been a menacing cackle. Oh, Alexander, always so quick to accuse. Of course, I want revenge. Those treacherous dogs turned their backs on me, and the mere thought of it sets my soul ablaze. But tell me, hero, is revenge truly such a terrible thing? Alexander folded his arms, or at least gave the impression of doing so as a glowing sphere of light. Yes, when it consumes you like this. Rusty isn't a tool for your vengeance. He deserves to make his own path, not inherit your grudges. And what about you, Alexander? Don't tell me you don't harbor grudges of your own. What about the companions who abandoned you, the people you couldn't save, the choices that haunt you? Don't stand there on your pedestal and pretend you're free of bitterness. Alexander flared brightly for a moment, but soon his light dimmed. That's not the same, a burden. I won't let the past chain me or dictate my actions. It's not. Don't lie to me, hero. I know how you feel. I know what emotions stir within you, especially after seeing those paladins of Galeni. What was that woman's name? Ah, right, Serafina. Did she not betray you? Along with all those other fake heroes. Alexander's light wavered, flickering like a torch caught in the wind. For a moment, the hero's orb dimmed to near darkness. That's enough. Can you two stop flickering around? You're going to get us caught. Gleam nodded subtly as the two orbs continued their ruckus. While their voices could only be heard by her and Rusty, their flickering lights were visible, drawing attention. The more they moved erratically, the greater the risk of being noticed by the merchants or anyone nearby. Rusty shifted his focus back to the present, realizing that if the two guides couldn't contain their rivalry, it might endanger their fragile escape plan. Look, I'm not sure who these demon dukes are, but first, we need to get out of here. I need you two to focus. Now, what do you suggest I do to escape? Rusty found the idea of facing powerful enemies intriguing, but this wasn't the time for such conversations. He was still stuck inside a cart filled with textiles, and Gleam was beginning to look tired. Unlike him, a seemingly immortal piece of armor that didn't need rest, Gleam was just a regular monster. She needed food and sleep. Her usual diet of mana crystals from the underground dungeon was unavailable here, and the strain was beginning to show. Depends on what our goal is, a burden mused. We could jump out into the bushes and make a run for it. I doubt those adventurers would give chase for long. They're here to guard the merchants, not hunt monsters. Our goal. Rusty repeated, his voice trailing off as he contemplated this issue. Gleam offered no response, looking as though she was about to fall asleep. Her weariness triggered a memory for Rusty, the day they first met. Gleam had fallen asleep on him after his evolution, in the safety of a cave filled with crystals. It had been a simpler time, spent hunting monsters with the reassurance of having a safe place to return to. Maybe that was what they needed now. How about a place to stay first? Oh? A place to stay? Do you wish to have a home? I thought you were more the adventurous type. Rusty's proposal clearly caught a burden off guard. Monsters like him, living armor, were not known for building homes. They usually wandered aimlessly, driven by instincts. However, Rusty was not a simple monster, he had his own goals and even fears. He knew that having a hideout was needed for survival. Having a base to come back to is a good start, but the question is, where? Alexander chimed in, directing his words not to Rusty but to a burden. Well, we're heading to one of the nearby cities, but there are many more ahead. Rusty could always take on the form of a fallen adventurer, or perhaps one of the locals. One of the locals? What do you mean? Alexander asked. With Rusty's unique skills, why not have him become an artisan? A larger home with a workshop would provide the perfect cover for our nocturnal activities. Even without the soul forge, he should be able to craft simple weapons to keep up his guise. A burden explained, a faint smugness in his voice. You want him to become an artisan? Like what, a blacksmith? Precisely. A burden's tone brightened with enthusiasm. Why should Rusty limit himself to just one persona? With his versatile loadout, he can easily switch between multiple identities. Imagine it, if he were a respected resident of the city, we wouldn't have to keep running. Even if one of his identities becomes a criminal, we can just discard it. Alexander's light flickered in contemplation as he saw the merit in this proposal. I see, that's not even a stupid idea. I do not propose stupid ideas, hero. I leave those to you. A burden gloated, his tone practically dripping with self-satisfaction. Rusty, meanwhile, deliberated over the suggestion. The notion of adopting a stable cover and building a place to call home had its appeal, especially given their current circumstances. His guide was right. If Rusty had another body to occupy, one with a good enough reputation, perhaps he wouldn't need to leave the city at all. It was a sprawling place, and the paladins were unlikely to search homes without cause. Right now, though, he was on the run, with no clear direction for the future. The idea of finding a place he could gradually develop into a sanctuary was becoming increasingly appealing. That doesn't sound bad, but where should I stay? The two orbs turned toward him, their flickering movements slowing as they noticed his genuine interest in the idea. Well, I do know the map of the area. We've got a few options to consider. There are 3 cities nearby that might serve as a starting point. Aberdan began while Alexander decided to wait before adding his own 2 cents. First is Dalbrim, a port city close to the western coastline. It's bustling with trade, particularly shipbuilding and repairs. You'd have easy access to imported materials for your soul forge. If you posed as a blacksmith or armorer, you'd blend in perfectly. Dalbrim? I'm not sure if that's a good idea. The nearest dungeon is far away. It's a port city with a lot of trade, but I'm not sure if we would be able to earn enough coin to buy a workshop. There were several problems with this choice, and one of them was the lack of a dungeon. Rusty, you used up all of your money, right? Asked Alexander. Yes? Without a dungeon, I won't be able to earn any money. That's right, and another thing, I'm not sure how well the locals would accept a blacksmith that wears heavy armor all the time. Some of them might get suspicious. Nonsense, we'll just cover him up with a robe so no one will be the wiser. Aberdan replied to Alexander while Rusty shook along with the wagon they were in. Gleam at this point had already managed to doze off and wasn't even listening to what they were talking about. I'm not sure if that would work, but perhaps. Or you could go to Blackthorn Hold. It's near a vast network of caves with an E-rank dungeon at its heart. Perfect for gathering rare materials and gaining strength. The city itself is rough, though, more of a haven for mercenaries and thieves than respectable artisans. But if you are looking for somewhere to grow stronger without too many prying eyes, it's ideal. Alexander flickered in disagreement. Yes, if you enjoy living in a pit of lawlessness and filth. You've been complaining a lot, but I don't see you offering any better options. Dear Rusty, it's probably best not to trust our hero's bad memories of these places. Just trust in my knowledge instead. Aberdan cackled, his voice filled with amusement. He had thoroughly studied all the information from both guilds, and Rusty knew this guide of his wasn't always motivated by his best interests. It was likely that at one of the locations, Aberdan had something to gain. One of the places was a bustling area filled with merchants, no shortage of commerce, but certainly no opportunities for earning through monster hunting. The other, however, was more like a den of thieves, where Rusty would have to be on constant alert for corrupt officials and robbers. Luckily, he still had the Thieves' Guild coin, tied not to his old Albert persona, but to his current self. It might give him an advantage in that shady location. How about we find a developing city? Somewhere where the prices are low and people are actually looking for an artisan. We won't have much luck in places that have long-running history. But where then? I'm not sure. If you aren't sure, then don't speak. Aberdan snorted. How quaint. Such places are nothing but breeding grounds for underdeveloped economies and local corruption. There is a reason why they are failures. We should go to an already developed city. Rusty started to consider Aberdan's point, but he wasn't entirely convinced. His goal wasn't just about making money, it was about building a future where he could lay low, build strength, and protect Gleam. A less populated city offered fewer variables working against him, but in a larger one, he would be able to hide himself among the crowd to avoid detection. What about somewhere between the two? A smaller city with trade, but also a community where I could grow without attracting too much attention. It doesn't have to be a major port or a city with multiple dungeons around it. So, a place that already is showing hope? Well, there was a city like that. I wouldn't say that it's developed, but much better than the average small town. However, it's near an area with orc tribes and some other barbaric tribes. It has a dungeon, but it is unable to prosper due to the constant conflicts nearby. Oh, what is its name? Rusty asked as the description sounded quite interesting. A place with ample battle outside, but also one where he could retreat behind some strong walls and rest. It's called Ferndale. Aberdan said, with a hint of reluctance. It's located at the edge of a forest region, right on the border between civilized lands and the wild territories. The dungeon there is said to be only partially explored, which could be used to our advantage as an out-of-place living armor, wouldn't be seen as strange. Rusty's interest was piqued. In the previous city, his presence had been too unique, always drawing the attention of adventurers. But perhaps in this new dungeon, he could find a place to continue his leveling efforts. Once the day broke, he could return to his new base of operations with all the loot he'd gathered. By day, he would be a humble artisan, blending in with the city's residents. By night, a menace within the dungeon, hunting for more power. Rusty was deep in thought as the wagon trundled along. The discussions between Aberdan and Alexander had given him plenty to consider, and Ferndale seemed like the most balanced option. Yet, they weren't free to make any decisions just yet. First, they needed to escape. Let's decide after we're out of this mess, Rusty said decisively. He glanced over at Gleam, who was now softly snoring. Agreed, Alexander responded. We can make plans later. First, we need to get off this wagon and out of sight. Finally, something we can all agree on. But if I may propose something. Aberdan chimed in, his tone smug as always. Yes. We should probably remain here a while longer. This caravan is heading toward the port city of Dalbrin. Around halfway, we'll reach a crossroads, likely in 2 days' time. These merchants are sure to take a break there. Once night falls, we can make our escape and decide where you wish to go next, Rusty. And we entered a wagon heading to the first city you propose, by accident. Hey. Oh? Are you accusing me of something, hero? Rusty rolled his non-existing eye sockets while letting the two bicker for longer. He decided to go along with this plan and wait for these 2 days. This whole situation made him want to create a smaller version of his armor, something that could hide in small areas like this while being able to move. The journey continued uneventfully over the next 2 days. The merchants talked amongst themselves, occasionally checking the cargo but thankfully never suspecting anything unusual. Gleam managed to regain some energy, though she remained cautious, curling up beside Rusty to avoid drawing attention. By the time the caravan reached the crossroads, dusk was falling, painting the horizon in shades of orange and purple. The merchants decided to make camp, setting up a ring of wagons and lighting fires for warmth and cooking. Rusty, hidden deep within the textile cart, waited patiently, his thoughts focused on the mission. As the night deepened, the camp grew quiet. The merchants and their guards had taken turns on watch but seemed otherwise relaxed. Gleam stretched beside him, her ant features shimmering faintly in the moonlight filtering through the gaps in the cart. It's time. Finally. Aberdan urged Rusty while both he and Alexander occupied his helmet. Once there they made his eye sockets glow, one in a more radiant white while the other remained a sinister black. However, right as Rusty was about to activate his loadout and change into his more slender form, something unexpected happened. An arrow came flying from the distance, striking their cart along with the others as shouts erupted from the darkness beyond the camp. Rusty froze in place, his senses sharpening as he scanned the surroundings with his life detection skill. The merchants stirred from their sleep, guards scrambling to grab their weapons. Bandits! People shouted and his skill confirmed it. The whole camp was surrounded and perhaps waiting for the best moment to escape had been a mistake. That's a lot of noise and a lot of people. The night erupted into chaos as the camp scrambled to defend itself. Rusty remained still, his mind trying to adapt to this unexpected twist. Gleam perked up beside him, her antennae twitching with unease. The merchants shouted to one another, their voices strained with panic. Degree. Stay down, Gleam, they probably don't know that we are here. If I understand people's behavior correctly, then they are here to steal the goods so we might be safe in here if they just don't find us. Rusty communicated silently with Gleam, compelling her to stop moving even as a few arrows pierced through the wagon's canvas. His life detection skill was picking up numerous signals outside, but he couldn't distinguish friend from foe. This was supposed to be his shortcut to Ferndale, his new area of operations. Yet, just as they were about to sneak through, disaster struck, leaving them stranded. Rusty. Aberdan's voice cut through his thoughts, urging decisive action. If those bandits find this cart, you'll be in a worse position. Do you really want to sit here and hope they miss you? I say we get out while the adventurers and merchants are still keeping them busy. Aberdan's argument made sense. Amid the chaos, most of the bandits would be preoccupied with fighting humanoid opponents, giving a monster ant like Gleam a chance to slip away unnoticed. Gleam was rested enough to cast a silencing spell, making stealth a viable option. But what about the merchants? Are we just going to abandon them to their fate? Ha! You expect Rusty to risk his life for some random merchants? That's absurd. Our survival comes first. Aberdan retorted, his tone rough. Alexander was maddened at this suggestion. His protest revealed the good-hearted nature he couldn't suppress. He wanted to help, but Rusty wasn't convinced it was a wise idea. Without Albert's body stored in his inventory, he couldn't convincingly pose as an adventurer. While he could shift into his armored form to resemble one, that guise came with a critical drawback: he wouldn't be able to speak. Then there was the matter of odds. It seemed clear that this small merchant caravan had gravely underestimated the dangers of this treacherous route. Rusty weighed the options as the camp fell into further disarray. The muffled clanging of swords and the crackling of flames reached his metallic ears through the canvas of the wagon. The merchant's terrified shouts mingled with the bandits' battle cries. He could feel Gleam trembling slightly beside him, her sharp instincts picking up on the growing carnage and chaos. Alexander's voice chimed in again, this time in a more pleading tone. Rusty, listen. Perhaps you can help these people. With your skills, we could. We could what? Involve ourselves in the petty squabbles of these insignificant people? What have they ever done for us? If any of them see Rusty for what he truly is, they'll kill him on the spot. And what about Lady Gleam? Her form could be exposed during the chaos of a fight. We must flee instead. Don't listen to this fool of a hero. Rusty sat silently amidst the clamor, his mind a battlefield where Alexander and Aberdan waged a war of ideology. The life detection signals from outside painted a vivid image of the chaos unfolding. Merchants scurried for safety, their movements frantic. The guards were outnumbered, their efforts barely holding the line against the bandits. Gleam, get ready, we will use the chaos to retreat. Ha, I knew you would see it my way. No, you can't be serious, we have to help them. Aberdan gloated, reveling in his argument, while Alexander desperately tried to convince him to reconsider. Rusty, however, knew that fighting was highly disadvantageous for him. As an unknown third party, he had no idea how either side would react if he revealed himself. For a moment, he considered hiding and waiting for the battle to end. But waiting wasn't always the safest option either. If the bandits won, they would undoubtedly search every wagon, or worse, take them all to their hideout. Once there, Rusty would be trapped in yet another prison, just like the one he had barely escaped from when dealing with the cultists. That harrowing experience was still fresh in his mind. No, waiting was too risky. Using the chaos of the battle and the cover of the dark night, Rusty resolved to run. It was his best chance at survival. Gleam didn't seem to care one way or the other and began casting the silencing spell. There didn't appear to be any mages on either side, so no one would be able to detect her use of mana. Soon, a soft white light enveloped both of them, signaling it was time to move. Rusty, maybe if. Be quiet, you two. We need to focus on escaping from here. With the command given, both Alexander and Aberdan were forced to become silent. Rusty's glowing eye sockets dimmed as Gleam began her careful movements, sneaking out from the fabric she had been hiding beneath. Her sharp mandibles made quick work of the material, cutting an opening to slip through. She skittered across the cart with silent precision, heading toward the rear. Rusty, still perched on her head, surveyed the scene as they reached the back of the cart. From there, they could see the full scope of the chaotic battle raging in the darkness. What they saw was quite gruesome. The camp was ablaze with chaos. Fires crackled, their light casting eerie, dancing shadows over the battlefield. The merchants and their guards, overwhelmed and underprepared, fought desperately to defend their lives and goods. Bandits surged like a tide, wielding crude weapons and overwhelming force. Some wagons were already on fire, and scattered belongings littered the ground, an unsettling mosaic of panic and despair. Rusty's life detection skill painted a grim picture. The camp's defenders were outnumbered 3-1. Merchants cowered behind crates, while their guards formed a shaky line against the bandits. The attackers were well coordinated, their movements suggesting a seasoned gang accustomed to raids. The odds for the merchants seemed slim. As Rusty and Gleam slipped from the wagon's cover, they paused behind a thick stack of crates. See? Look at this mess. And you wanted to help these fools, Alexander? They're already finished. Rusty, we're wasting precious time just standing here. Aberdan's voice broke the silence, but they continued with the escape, even as the two guides continued barter. Even so. This is wrong. We could turn the tide. Rusty, if you distract the bandits and give the merchants a chance, they could probably escape or perhaps launch a counter-attack. Did you miss the part where they're outnumbered and outmatched? A distraction would only expose Rusty. Don't let your misplaced nobility get us killed. Rusty ignored the argument, focusing instead on scanning the battlefield. The bandits weren't only after goods, they were brutal and methodical, cutting down anyone who resisted. The merchants were beginning to flee, abandoning their carts as guards fell one by one. This was a good opportunity and he would use this confusion to their advantage. Quick Gleam, now is the chance, let's go for those bushes. The small monster ant darted swiftly, using the shadows for cover. There wasn't much ground to traverse, and the chaos around them ensured that no one paid them any attention. Soon, the pair reached a dense thicket of bushes and dove straight in. This was it. There were no pursuers, and the flickering light from the burning flames didn't reach this far. They were finally safe. Gleam continued to skitter forward without hesitation, but suddenly. Gleam, stop! Rusty called out to his partner and she stopped. The voices of the bandits and adventurers clashing could still be heard and they weren't fully safe, so she was clearly confused. No, I'm fine, but could you lower me down? Gleam nodded and used her forelimbs to carefully lift Rusty off her head. Once he was on the ground, he activated one of his loadouts. His helmet began to expand, pieces of armor materializing and assembling themselves into a full suit. Within moments, the transformation was complete, and he stood in his familiar all-rounder Iron Twilight armor form. Now back on his own two legs, the distant flames danced and reflected against his metallic surface, casting an imposing silhouette in the dark. Have you reconsidered, Rusty? Alexander asked, his voice seemingly hopeful, but a burden sounded far less happy. I hope not. You aren't seriously going to charge in there to help those insignificant pests? Charge in? No, but I can at least do this. Rusty wasn't entirely sure why he was doing this, but something about abandoning the group didn't sit right with him. It felt as though, in some small way, they had helped him. Their presence had enabled his escape from the city, and letting them be slaughtered left a strange, bitter aftertaste. Perhaps Alexander's constant complaints had finally worn him down, but whatever the reason, Rusty decided to act. He wouldn't directly help these people as doing so would be far too risky, but there was one thing he could do from his position without putting himself in too much danger. Thanks to her small size, Gleam was able to squeeze through the bushes with ease, and now Rusty found himself behind the bandits. They were encircling the merchant caravan from all sides, but most of their forces were concentrated here. It was clear they wouldn't anticipate an attack from their rear, let alone one that could affect such a wide area. While Rusty had no intention of engaging them directly, he did possess skills that worked exceptionally well against humans and other intelligent races. Using the last moments of Gleam's silencing spell, he crept closer to their position. Once he was in place, he began to execute his plan. Rusty crouched low behind a pile of rocks and activated his limb control ability. His right arm plate moved, and the gauntlet flew forward, its metallic gleam catching the faintest glimmers of moonlight. The bandits, engrossed in their brutal work, didn't notice the metal hand moving into their midst. Suddenly, with a small thud, it landed at the center of the group. Some of the bandits noticed that it was there but were unable to comprehend what this was until it was too late. Black smoke began to seep out, thick and heavy, expanding rapidly and engulfing the bandits. The smoke swirled and writhed as if alive, infused with Rusty's dark energy. A pitch-black glow pulsed intermittently within the shroud, casting eerie shadows that made the bandits freeze in their tracks. One by one, the bandits began to cough violently, clutching their throats as if choking on the oppressive air. The smoke wasn't lethal, but it drained their strength, filling their lungs with an unnatural weight and sapping their will to fight. Rusty had used this tactic before, and to maximize the effect the darkness needed to escape from within his body parts. The smoke spread quickly, and soon, the once confident attackers were on their knees, wheezing and disoriented. Their weapons clattered to the ground, and the bandits who had been coordinating the assault now squirmed helplessly. From the other side of the camp, the besieged merchants and their defenders noticed the sudden turn of events. The bandits' rear line had crumbled and even the ones not there had stopped their assault out of confusion. They were looking around, trying to find the enemy that was responsible for this black miasma, but before they could, the adventurers shouted out. Now's our chance! The defenders seized the opportunity, loosing a volley of arrows into the incapacitated bandits. The projectiles struck true, and several bandits fell instantly, their cries lost in the chaos. The merchants rallied, some grabbing what weapons they could find and joining the fray. The sudden burst of resistance turned the tide, and the attackers, demoralized and weakened, began to retreat. Rusty watched from his vantage point, satisfied that the merchants were gaining the upper hand. He didn't linger. With the camp still in turmoil, he turned and motioned to Gleam, who had been waiting in the shadows. Together, they slipped away into the night, leaving the merchants to finish what remained of the fight. As the pair moved through the forest, Rusty glanced upward. Two large spheres illuminated the night sky, the moons of this world, rarely seen together. One glowed with a deep, dark blue hue, while the other shimmered faintly red. Their combined light reflected off his metallic frame, casting an ethereal glow as he walked through the shadows toward his next destination, the city of Ferndale. He wasn't sure what awaited him there, but one thing was certain, he was finally free to carve his own path and pursue his desires. You did the right thing, Rusty. You may not realize it, but you've saved lives tonight. Is that so? Rusty responded to his guide, the bright white light from his right eye socket casting a glow. His reflection in the left socket was a burden, his pitch-black form barely visible against the night. Bah, that was just a waste of magical energy, energy that you might need. What if they attacked us instead? Rusty knew a burden wasn't wrong. One wrong move in this treacherous world, and he would be dead. He wasn't in a dungeon anymore and there was no dungeon core to restore him now. He didn't know what happened to monsters that died in the outside world, but he wasn't eager to find out. Now then, in which direction is this Ferndale and how long will I need to walk there? While his guides continued to bicker, Rusty asked his question. He was deep in a darkened forest, with no clear idea of where to go. His navigation skills were virtually non-existent. On foot? Probably at least a week from here, but it could take longer. Well then, let's go. Gleam chittered softly beside him, the sound a reassuring one, as if expressing her enjoyment of the situation. Together, they pressed deeper into the forest, leaving the chaos behind and focusing on the uncertain journey ahead. A woman pressed her back harder against the rough wooden post behind her, trying to stifle her trembling breath. Around her, other captives huddled in similar terror, the flickering firelight from the goblin campfires casting grotesque shadows on their faces. The creatures laughed and barked orders in their strange monster tongue, dragging struggling victims into the darkness beyond. She didn't dare look at the others taken before them, those whose cries still echoed faintly through the encampment. Her heart raced when she saw three goblins approach her group, their wicked grins and filthy weapons promising nothing but pain. She gripped the arm of a woman next to her, both trembling as the short monsters moved closer. There was no hope, no sign of anyone who could help them, but then, suddenly something strange happened. The commotion began as a distant clatter of weapons, followed by guttural goblin screeches. It wasn't unusual for goblins to squabble among themselves, but this was different. The cries of alarm and the sound of steel clashing grew louder, closer. A strange metallic screech echoed in the night, followed by the unmistakable sounds of something hitting the ground. The goblins stopped in their tracks, their expressions shifting from glee to alarm. One barked an order, and the three turned to rush toward the disturbance. The woman wondered if adventurers had come to save them, but the lack of coherent voices was alarming. She craned her neck to see beyond the firelight, but the smoky air and the goblins' frantic movements blocked her view. A heavy thud resounded, followed by the sharp cry of a goblin silenced mid-scream. More of the goblins became alert, running off into the dark forest where their voices were silenced. One by one, the little green monsters were being exterminated, by who or what she could only speculate. The woman's heart pounded in her chest as the chaos in the goblin camp escalated. She clutched the arm of the woman beside her, both frozen in fearful anticipation. The firelight danced on the crude weapons left behind by the goblins as they rushed into the forest to confront whatever had disrupted their plans. The shrill cries of the goblins gave way to unsettling silence, broken only by sporadic, metallic thuds and the faint hiss of something sharp cutting through flesh. A moment of eerie quiet followed. The air felt thick with tension, each passing second an agonizing eternity. The woman strained her ears, hoping for a clue, but all she heard was the shallow breathing of her fellow captives. Then, a goblin staggered back into the camp, clutching its neck where black smoke oozed from a deep wound. Its eyes widened with terror as it fell to its knees before collapsing face first into the dirt. The smoke dissipated, leaving a foul, lingering scent. The sight drew gasps from the prisoners, their eyes glued to the dead goblin. The woman dared to lift her gaze, and what she saw chilled her further. Emerging from the shadows was a figure unlike anything she had ever seen, a knight in greyish, imposing armor. Its form glinted faintly under the moonlight, edges sharp and angular, yet it moved with an unnatural fluidity. A pair of glowing, piercing eyes radiated from within the helmet's visor, one a stark white, the other as dark as the abyss, as though the figure itself had been forged from the night. It moved forward with an eerie calmness, holding a sword submerged in darkened miasma. The night fell silent with only the breathing of the nearby bound women. The armored figure approached, its blade growing near. The captives recoiled in fear, their minds racing to make sense of what was happening. One of the women, her auburn hair matted with dirt and sweat, whispered in awe, her voice trembling. "An adventurer, he's here to save us." Her words were laced with hope, but one of the other women shrieked in terror. "No. No, he's not a man. It's a monster. Look at it. It's a living armor. It's here to finish us off." The knightly figure paid no mind to their reactions. It stopped just before the captives, towering over them, its presence overwhelming. The sword it held shimmered ominously, the haze of black mist replaced by cold iron. The woman who had called him a monster sobbed quietly, resigned to what she believed was her end. But instead of striking them down, the figure crouched low and raised its sword. The sharp edge met the ropes binding their ankles, cutting through effortlessly. The captives froze, confused by the unexpected act of mercy. Was this just an adventurer wearing monster-like armor or a dream invoked by their fear? One by one, the bindings around their wrists and ankles were severed. The women exchanged glances, too afraid to speak, unsure if this was some cruel trick. When the last woman was freed, the figure stood, its glowing eyes scanning the goblin camp. Why is it? I don't know, but be quiet, maybe it will go away." The armored knight turned away from them without a word, striding into the heart of the goblin camp. Its movements were swift yet measured, as if it had no regard for the chaos it caused. It ignored the captives entirely, as though they were insignificant to whatever mission it pursued. The women sat motionless, unsure whether to run or remain where they were. Some whispered frantic prayers of thanks, while others stared at the knights retreating back in wide-eyed confusion. "What is it doing?" "It's gathering something." All of them sat there, petrified with fear, as the monster prowled through the goblin village. It focused mainly on collecting crude weapons, but also gathered various items like iron bars and even pots. Methodically, it piled everything onto a sturdy-looking cloth made of deer hide, another item scavenged from the village. Eventually, the monster returned to them. But instead of attacking or finishing them off, it began patting them down. The women froze, not daring to move a muscle as the cold iron gauntlets brushed against them. This creature was truly bizarre. It took some of their belongings, coins, earrings, and even shoes. Strangely, it felt less like they were being rescued and more like they were being robbed. Yet, no one dared to complain. After all, the goblins had been slain, and their lives were far more precious than any material possessions they had lost. As the armored figure finished its peculiar search, the women exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to feel relieved or alarmed. Some clutched at their missing belongings, while others dared not even breathe too loudly. The monster or adventurer carefully secured the scavenged items into its leather sack before tying it shut. Some of the women could have sworn that some of the items had vanished, but they assumed that their minds were just playing tricks on them. "Maybe it's not a monster. It took my earrings. What kind of monster does that? Shh. Don't provoke it. I think it's about to leave." The women started to whisper among each other as their savior began to retreat. They were almost sure now that this being didn't want to harm them, but it was hard to place trust in such a strange figure. As the armored being stepped further away from the captives, one of the women noticed something peculiar. A small, ghostly white ant leaped from a pile of goblin remains and landed on the armored figure's shoulder. The creature paused for a moment and even looked their way, then settled into place. "Did you see that?" the woman whispered, pointing at the silvery ant that had now vanished with their strange savior. "What? I didn't see anything, maybe we should leave." The other women showed no interest in the ghost ant as the stench of the goblins' bodies and the carnage around them was already almost unbearable. In time, they managed to find the strength to stand and survey their surroundings. The village, once bustling with tens of goblins, had become a desolate wasteland of death and silence. Fires still crackled here and there, their flickering flames casting ghostly light over the lifeless goblins. The strange being had taken all the crude weapons, leaving only remnants of the chaos. The oppressive aura of danger that had once suffused the village was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. From the distance, they suddenly heard something, shouts accompanied by the flicker of torches moving toward them. But this time, it was not a monster. The voices were human, speaking their language. Adventurers had arrived to save them. Unbeknownst to the others, Rusty was already making his escape. His iron reserves had been depleted for the auction and his previous repairs, so he scavenged what he could from the goblin camp to rebuild his stock. Each piece of crude iron, every bent sword, and broken spear was an opportunity for Rusty to restore his form in the future. There were far too many items for him to carry, and his SP was limited. He was forced to use some of the goblin's belongings to fashion a makeshift sack, though various weapons jutted out, scratching at his metal frame. "I'm glad we rescued those women, but did you really have to take all of their money? But if I'm going to open a shop in a city, I'll need money, right?" "Well," Rusty responded to Alexander, who had eagerly supported the idea of attacking the goblin village. A burden, as always, was against it, so Rusty decided to try a different approach. His two guides often bickered, their minds being polar opposites. Rather than choosing just one of their approaches, he decided to merge both. He agreed to help rescue the women, but only under a few conditions. One was that he would not assist them in returning to their hometown, and another was that he could take any belongings that seemed useful, just as a burden had advised. Of course it was. "This isn't a charity, silly hero. We need to take what we need to survive. If only you weren't there to fill his head with nonsense." Alexander sighed as he nestled within Rusty's right eye socket. It hadn't been long since the incident at the merchant caravan, yet their journey had made little progress. Navigating through the dark forests while avoiding detection was adding another week to their travels, and the frequent battles with monsters threatened to delay them even further. Despite the setbacks, Rusty remained unfazed. To him, this little expedition was an exciting adventure. However, there was a small problem. "Are you still feeling bad, Gleam? Just wait a moment, I see a cave there." While Rusty was feeling great, his friend Gleam wasn't in full health. It seemed that gleaming ants had a very specific diet that required a constant infusion of mana. Without mana crystals or mana potions to supplement her diet, Gleam's health was beginning to deteriorate. This was another reason Rusty had been hunting monsters like goblins, hoping to find mana-rich materials. Fortunately, one of the monsters he had defeated was a goblin shaman, and its monster core was now safely stored in his inventory. They just needed to get to a safe location where she could rest and perhaps sleep while he thought of where to head next. Rusty and Gleam made their way into the shadowy cave, the mouth of which was hidden behind a thicket of dense foliage. Inside, the air was cool and slightly damp, with the faint sound of water dripping from stalactites. Rusty set down his makeshift sack of scavenged materials near the cave wall, the metal clanging softly against the stone. Gleam staggered slightly, her usual energetic movement replaced with dulled movements. "All right, this should be a good spot to rest. Let me get that monster core out." Gleam perked up slightly, her antennae twitching with renewed interest. She crawled toward Rusty, her eagerness clear despite her sluggish movements. Rusty reached into his inventory and retrieved a small glowing crystal. Its dark green hue pulsed faintly in the dim light of the cave, but it wasn't strong enough to cast shadows on the walls. Monster cores came in all shapes and sizes, but this one more closely resembled a mana crystal than a traditional core. Gleam scuttled forward, her mandibles parting as she emitted a soft, excited chittering sound. "Wait!" A burden's voice rang sharply in Rusty's mind. "Don't let her just eat it. There is too much mana in that monster core, it could last us for a week." Gleam froze, tilting her head as though confused. "Oh, it could? But how? Should I crack it into smaller pieces?" "No, that will just destroy it. Instead, we need to use some water. You've gathered some pots from those mindless goblins, right?" "Ah, I did." Rusty wasn't entirely sure how this would work, but if the monster core could sustain Gleam for longer, it would ease his concerns about her health. The idea intrigued him, so he decided to give it a try. He had a pot scavenged from the goblins, and gathering water was simple since the cave was near a stream. Though Gleam was tired, she still helped by collecting sticks and dried leaves for the fire they needed to build. Once all the preparations were complete, Rusty set about creating what he could only describe as mana soup. First, they made a fire with the help of Gleam's magic. It took them a few tries and Alexander needed to explain a few times how to properly ignite kindling, but soon a steady flame crackled in the cave's entrance. Rusty placed the pot over the fire and filled it with the clear stream water he had collected. As the water began to simmer, he carefully lowered the monster core into the pot, following a burden's instructions. The core pulsed faintly as it sank, sending tendrils of shimmering green mana into the water. The liquid quickly changed color, transforming into a faintly glowing elixir. Gleam's antennae quivered with excitement, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten as she watched the process. Monster cores from magical creatures are often used as a base for mana potions, boiling them hastens the process. Now, don't forget to stir it, the mana needs to be distributed evenly. Rusty went through the crude items he got from the goblins and found something that resembled an iron ladle. It was bent in several places but was good enough to stir the mixture. After around 10 minutes the glow softened, and the water became a uniform pale green. Gleam chirped softly, her eagerness crystal clear. It should be ready. Rusty asked, and after a burden confirmed, he finally let Gleam take a few sips. She bent her small frame toward the pot and sipped delicately from the edge. Her movements grew steadier with each sip, the faint flicker of her natural luminescence returning. After a few moments, she stepped back, her antennae twitching happily. She looks much better already. Alexander remarked. Good job, Rusty. Yet. A burden muttered. Now don't waste what's left. Seal it in something and keep it safe. Rusty nodded and used his SP to store this item in his stash tab. With the pot there he had gained some more time. Now they needed to continue trekking towards their new destination and start their new life. Gah! A ball of magical energy collided with a short, green monster, propelling it forward into a shining blade. In an instant, the monster's head flew through the air, landing with a dull thud on the forest floor. Goblin bodies littered the ground, their blood soaking into the grass and weeds. Congratulations, you have gained a level. Rusty heard the familiar sound of the world's system announcing his level up. Now that all the monsters had been defeated, he could finally stop and check his progress. He opened his status window, along with those of his friends. She was leveling up quickly and would probably reach her next evolution before he did. Name: Gleam. Classification: Lesser Silvery Magical Gleaming Ant FL5. Type: Insectoid. Hit points HP: 37 Magic points MP: 67 Stamina points SP: 43 Strength: 28F. Agility: 48F. Dexterity: 34F. Constitution: 32F. Intelligence: 51F. Wisdom: 52F. Willpower: 48F. Durability: F. You've been steadily leveling up, Gleam. Oh, yeah, I also did. It shouldn't take long. These outside monsters are quite high level. But it's a lot harder to find them in this forest. Name: Rusty. Classification: Twilight Iron Armor EL10. Type: Magical/Inorganic. Hit points HP: 261/261. Magic points MP: 210/210. Special points SP: 50/50. Strength: 107E+. Agility: 80E. Dexterity: 79E. Constitution: 110E+. Intelligence: 85E. Wisdom: 87E. Willpower: 86E. Durability: D. Rusty noticed that 2 of his stats had now reached E and rank. This iron form seemed to progress faster than his previous bronze one, with him gaining more and more stats with each level up. He wondered if this meant he could reach D rank soon or if it might be better to wait and spend another evolution in the E+ rank. His guides had given him a few pointers about this, advising that it might be wiser to hold off. If his stats were higher during an evolution, there was a chance of attaining a superior evolutionary form. This applied not only to his physical form but also to his skills and abilities. However, now that he was out in the world with only Gleam to rely on, reaching D rank more quickly might be critical to his survival. For now, he decided to hold off and make the final choice back at the Soul Forge. This is taking a while. Rusty muttered, his gaze scanning the dense trees. This forest seems endless. Well, they do call it the Everlasting Black Forest. Alexander replied from nearby. Rusty nodded as he bent down to pick up some crude iron weapons the goblins dropped. The iron content wasn't great, but it was still better than having to mine for it, as he'd been forced to do with copper and tin to produce bronze. He was free now, free of the dungeon that had given birth to him and far from the confines of the city he'd first known. The vastness of this world, teeming with strange and fascinating creatures, was something Rusty had yet to fully grasp. So, this is true freedom. Gleam climbed onto Rusty's shoulder, giving his helmet a playful poke with her antennae. She seemed curious about what was on his mind. "Oh, it's nothing," Rusty said, his voice thoughtful. "I was just thinking about the future, and how it's not all that different from what I've already seen." Rusty was still close to a newborn existence. Just a few months ago, he had been created, and now he found himself set free in the vast expanse of this strange world. He was still trying to wrap his hollow brain around what he should do or what his purpose might be. One of his goals was to create a lair, a place to call home and return to after his journeys. With that in mind, he was traveling toward the town of Ferndale. One thing he had noticed was how much empty space this world contained. There were vast stretches of wilderness with little in between. While raiding goblin villages and outposts within the thick forest, he found them scattered hours apart. It seemed that the large cities, particularly those built by humans, dominated the land, leaving much of the wilderness untouched. Though Rusty appreciated the wide-open emptiness, the monotony was beginning to wear on him. The endless sight of similar trees and forest critters during his trek was growing dull. He found himself wishing he could reach the town faster. As he walked, his thoughts drifted to the workshop he planned to set up. While the shop would serve as a cover for his more clandestine nocturnal activities, Rusty wondered how the people of Ferndale would receive him as a craftsman. His current skills were limited to creating basic iron weaponry and possibly steel items without enchantments. Yet, he hoped that in the future, his abilities would evolve to include more advanced and magical creations. The idea of building something lasting and meaningful, both for his lair and his craft, kept him motivated as he pushed forward through the endless trees. These don't look too good either. Another failure. Rusty's thoughts were interrupted by a burden, whose black, orb-like form hovered over a group of human corpses the goblins had been devouring. Rusty frowned. He was still searching for a replacement body for Albert's but had yet to find one in good enough condition. It seemed well-preserved or mummified corpses were rare in this world, or perhaps he needed to search in a similar kind of location to where he had found Albert's remains. "Bah, they're all half-eaten and already decomposing." A burden's tone was clearly annoyed as he hovered from one half-eaten body to another. "Perhaps we should just ambush a few adventurers and be done with it. If we can't find a good corpse, we can just make one." Before Rusty could respond, Alexander's glowing orb form interjected sharply. "That's out of the question, you bloodthirsty demon." Rusty sighed as the two began bickering again. It wasn't the first time their opposing views on morality had clashed, but ultimately, the decision would fall to him. The thought of killing a party of adventurers lingered in his mind. He could assume the form of one of them and pose as a lone survivor. However, there were complications. Adventurers were often tied to nearby cities or guilds, and their sudden disappearance could attract unwanted attention. It seemed wiser to find someone within the forest, someone disconnected from the cities, before moving forward. Slaying a local blacksmith was another option, but it posed risks of its own. People might become suspicious if he suddenly appeared clad in heavy iron armor. Every choice carried its dangers, and Rusty knew he needed to tread carefully if he wanted his plans to remain unnoticed. After witnessing the High Priest and the Paladins in action, he realized just how insignificant he was in comparison. Unless he reached the level of that robed man, he could hardly hope to make himself stand out. Yet, there was a certain thrill in all of this. Hiding among those who would see him dead was undeniably intriguing. "Oh, these even have a golden coin here." While finding a dead body for his possession skill had been delayed, Rusty was making steady progress in regaining his lost wealth. His storage was now brimming with iron salvaged from goblin weapons, and the green creatures seemed to have a fondness for sparkly coins as well. Rusty's metallic fingers clinked softly as he sifted through the pile of coins the goblins had hoarded. Most were plain copper, but scattered among them were a few valuables, lockets, amulets, and bracelets that he could pawn off once he settled somewhere. All of these items had been taken from the people the monsters had kidnapped and attacked. Sometimes, they were merchants passing through the woods, other times, bandits or simple farmers. From what he had heard, these small green creatures were a persistent plague. They reproduced quickly and had an unsettling method to ensure their numbers. Women of other races were used for this vile act, while the men were killed and eaten. It was a grim but effective tactic. Despite their cunning, the goblins were weak. Their crude weapons couldn't even scratch his metallic frame, and their poisonous arrows were useless against him. To them, he was like a neutral predator, hunting them day or night without fear of their defenses. Are there any spider caves nearby? I think there might be some arachnids around here, but these won't be as easy to kill as the dungeon ones, Rusty. I've noticed. These monsters don't react well to my light or the dark. His elemental attacks weren't proving very effective against the creatures he'd encountered. It seemed his light abilities only worked well against undead or darkness-aligned monsters. Against anything else, they were limited to startling or blinding his enemies. Similarly, his darkness abilities weren't much use against the goblins, working better on humans or other intelligent races. Still, the darkness could be useful for cloaking himself in a shroud to mask his movements and attacks. But it seemed most monsters had some kind of inborn protection against it. Arachnoid monsters usually preserve bodies. Alexander replied again, slowly liquefying their insides while they drain them. So, if you're looking for preserved bodies, with not much on the inside, this might be our best bet. The two of them turned toward the black orb as Alexander spoke. Aberdan didn't have a mouth to show expressions, but his smug satisfaction was palpable. He clearly relished being needed for his knowledge. Oh my, what would you two ever do without me? Aberdan cackled, fully aware that he was the only one with knowledge of the area's layout. His memorization skills were unparalleled, but Rusty couldn't help but wonder if relying on him so heavily was wise. Once he reached the city, he resolved to get his own map and start practicing navigation himself. Perhaps some of Aberdan's abilities had already rubbed off on him after their souls merged, along with Alexander's. It wasn't such a far-fetched idea to think that, in time, he might acquire all the skills these two had possessed when they were still alive. He wondered if the tales they both told him were all true as they made them appear as the two strongest beings in the world. If he could gain all of their power, wouldn't that make him the most powerful being to ever walk this world? The thought of such a thing made him giddy with anticipation, but he would need to go through several evolutions to get to such a point. Just tell me what you know, Aberdan. Eyes closed face, Gleam nodded as Sheeta was starting to get annoyed with Aberdan's character. The Demon Lord seemed to be happy that he was getting under their skin, but quickly answered as he was now compelled by Rusty's direct order. Well, yes and no. What do you mean? Well, there are giant spiders, as some like to call them, around, but you won't find them in caves. Aberdan paused dramatically, clearly savoring the moment as Rusty and Gleam waited impatiently. They live in the upper canopy of the forest, high up in the trees, hidden among the leaves and branches. Their webs are nearly invisible to the untrained eye, and they rarely descend to the ground unless provoked or hunting. This makes them exceedingly difficult to locate, let alone kill. Aberdan lowered his voice, his glow dimming as if he was trying to tell a scary story at a campfire. They aren't that difficult to kill, I've hunted them before. Alexander interrupted, which caused Aberdan to buzz with frustration. Fine, Mr. Know-it-all. Why don't you enlighten us about these easy-to-kill spiders? Since you've hunted them before, I'm sure you have a foolproof plan. Rusty groaned inwardly and stopped the two from arguing again. Both of you, focus. What do me and Gleam need to know? The spiders here are different from dungeon varieties. Their main strength is their environment. They use the height of the canopy to their advantage, descending on silken threads to snatch prey before retreating upward again. Their webs are their deadliest weapon, thin, strong, and coated with a paralytic toxin that affects most living creatures. Paralytic toxin? Then I should be fine. Rusty retorted, knowing well that substances like poison would not affect his iron body. Yes, your inorganic constitution will make you immune, but... Alexander turned slightly to point himself at the silvery ant on Rusty's shoulder. Gleam will, perhaps it would be better for her to remain in the back line for now and assist you with her spells. It's okay, Gleam, I'm sure that there is something that you can help with. Gleam wasn't too happy to hear that she would perhaps need to sit this one out. Luckily, Alexander already had an idea of what she should be doing. There is something she could do. These webs are drenched in these toxins which are highly flammable, the weakest fire will ignite them like dry tinder. If Gleam can use her magical energy to produce a controlled flame spell, she can burn through the webs quickly, creating safe paths or even driving the spiders out of hiding. Rusty nodded, taking in Alexander's suggestion. Gleam perked up slightly at the mention of her potential role. She tilted her head as if considering the challenge, then gave an enthusiastic nod of agreement. While she wasn't specialized in fire spells, she had gone through mana training. Shifting it to align to flames would be a challenge, but after mastering the silence spell, This shouldn't be a problem. Great, then it's settled. Rusty said, looking up at the thick trees above them. While there were no spiders or webs there, he was already looking towards the new challenge. So, will we have to keep an eye out for these webs, or do you know where these spiders gather? Ha, leave it to me, Rusty, I'll guide you there. Soon, the group departed for their next destination, the arachnid-infested parts of the Black Forest. As the trek continued, it became clear that these monsters would be trickier and more dangerous than the goblins. The villages that had once dotted the landscape ceased to appear, and the ones resembling them were devoid of anything and covered in thick webbing. It was clear that the apex predator was not the goblin anymore, but something lurking deeper, just waiting for them to step into their territory. An unsettling change in atmosphere marked the transition from goblin-infested forests to the spider's domain. The air grew colder, and shafts of sunlight struggled to penetrate the canopy above. Fine, shimmering strands of webbing hung like veils between the trees, glistening faintly whenever light touched them. Occasionally, faint scuttling sounds echoed from above, putting everyone on edge. Are you too sure that this is going to work? Getting cold feet, Rusty? But I guess you're made from cold iron. A burden cackled inside Rusty's helmet as the group approached the spider-infested forest. They had made sure to arrive during the day, knowing the webs would be somewhat visible in sunlight. The glinting strands reflected faintly, revealing the network of traps, but the thick canopy of trees filtered the light, leaving much of the forest shrouded in shadows. The dimness provided perfect cover for the monsters lurking out of sight, ready to pounce. No, but won't the entire forest burn down, along with all the preserved bodies these monsters hold? Rusty asked. He hadn't been in this world long, but he understood how fire worked. If the webs were as flammable as a burden and Alexander claimed, setting them alight indiscriminately could spark a wildfire. The blaze might spread through the everlasting Black Forest, consuming kilometers of wilderness. Worse still, such an inferno could attract the attention of nearby settlements or even the local adventurer guild, a complication they couldn't afford. That's a valid concern, Alexander admitted, his tone calm. But the flammable toxins are usually concentrated in the capture nets these spiders create. Their lairs and the wrappings around their victims aren't as combustible. So, if we stick to the plan and lure 1 or 2 spiders first, we should avoid any large-scale fire. I see. Rusty nodded, turning his helmeted head toward Gleam. Gleam, be ready with those flame spells. Once I give you the signal, cast it. Can you handle that? Omega. Gleam chirped confidently, her antennae twitching with excitement at the chance to show off her magic. She quickly skittered down from Rusty's shoulder and took cover behind a tree that wasn't completely veiled in webbing. Her body quivered slightly as she glanced up at the enwebbed trees. Her instincts screamed of danger, but she was ready. While the spiders were scary, with her friend Rusty around, she knew that there was nothing to fear. Rusty stepped forward, his iron frame gleaming faintly in the filtered sunlight. Carefully, he trudged into the maze of webs, the strands sticking to his metal plating but failing to harm him. The material was incredibly strong and sticky, pulling him to a halt almost immediately. With each step, more of the sticky fibers clung to him, forming an unyielding trap. Despite his immunity to the paralytic toxins coating the threads, the sheer tensile strength of the webs immobilized him. He glanced back at Gleam, who peeked cautiously from behind the tree, her small silver body reflecting the faint light. I'm stuck already. Rusty muttered, testing the web's strength with a few futile tugs. He was surprised, and it made sense while this whole place was deserted. If he couldn't get in more than a few steps, then other adventurers or even monsters probably couldn't either. Let's hope your plan works. Before long, the forest grew eerily silent, broken only by the faint clicking of approaching legs. From above, a massive spider descended on a silken thread. Its dark brown, fur-like covering glistened faintly in the sunlight that filtered through the canopy. Its many eyes gleamed as they focused intently on its prey. Mistaking him for an adventurer ensnared in its web, the spider clicked its fangs menacingly, creeping closer with deliberate caution. Rusty, however, remained calm and waited. The monster moved slowly, taking its time to inspect what it believed was its latest catch. Rusty struggled against the webbing, managing to free an arm briefly before becoming even more entangled. It was clear that the more he struggled, the tighter the web held him. Finally, he stopped moving, feigning defeat. To the spider, his stillness signaled that its toxins had done their work. Satisfied, the creature descended fully to the forest floor. Its movements were slow but purposeful, its fangs shone with venom as it prepared to strike. Now, Gleam. A small marble-sized orb of fire shot from behind the tree, streaking toward the webbing surrounding Rusty. The flames ignited on contact, spreading rapidly across the toxic strands. The sudden blaze caused the spider to screech and recoil, its sensitive legs catching fire. The creature thrashed violently, dropping to the ground as it tried to extinguish the flames, but it was too late. The web burned away, freeing Rusty and consuming the spider in one swift motion. Rusty stumbled forward, shaking off the remnants of the burnt webbing clinging to his iron frame. Though the sticky burning threads engulfed him, they caused little actual damage to his metallic body. Behind him, the spider thrashed violently, its movements erratic but still full of life. Wasting no time, Rusty reached for his sword. With one swift motion, he drove the blade into the monster's head. The spider's 8 legs twitched wildly in all directions, its body spasming in its final moments. Soon, the creature stilled, lifeless. "Good shot, Gleam." Gleam chirped, waving her antennae excitedly. She looked proud of her success, her confidence boosted by the small victory. The flames continued to churn for a while, but just like Alexander mentioned previously, they did not consume the entire forest. Eventually, they reached a part of the webbing that wasn't as flammable and sputtered out, leaving only faint smoke and scorched remains in their wake. "I told you it would," Alexander said smugly. "Now we know the plan is viable, so you can execute it on a greater scale. I suppose even a broken clock is right twice a day." A burden muttered in a rather disappointed tone, while Alexander finally had something to gloat about. "Now, let's move along with the plan." This was just the first test of their grand master plan. They stood on the outskirts of the spider monster territory, where the concentration of these monstrous spiders was relatively low. This allowed them to safely test their theory. The experiment confirmed that the forest wouldn't ignite into an uncontrollable blaze. Now that the sticky threads had burned away, they were free to search for their target, well-preserved bodies for Rusty. "Oh, you'll check? But what if something happens?" Gleam was quite the climber and some nearby spider cocoons were hanging up in the trees. She wanted to go there to check, but Rusty hesitated. Gleam's enthusiasm was infectious, but the sight of the dangling cocoons high in the canopy made him wary. Each of the silken prisons swayed gently in the breeze, like morbid fruit waiting to fall. If there was anything he had learned from this world so far, it was to never underestimate even the smallest threats. He turned to the monster spider he had just defeated for confirmation and activated his identification skill. Just as expected, the monster was not something his friend would be able to handle that easily. Classification: Giant Forest Spider E. Type: Arachnoid. Description: Charred remains of a giant forest spider. This monster is commonly found in large forests. This spider poses a threat to travelers, particularly at night, when its dark exoskeleton provides excellent camouflage. The creature's webs are highly adhesive and toxic, making them nearly impossible to escape once ensnared. Known for weaving enormous, intricate webs high among the trees, this monster serves as a natural predator within its habitat. Its nature is not solitary, finding strength in high numbers. The explanation was longer than what he was accustomed to, but his skill had continued to level up, allowing him to gather far more information about this world on his own. "I don't think that's a good idea, Gleam. It's not that I don't trust you, but there might be more of them hiding in there. What if one jumps out?" "Well, I'm glad that you are confident in your abilities, but there might be too many there to handle." Gleam was more of a caster than a fighter. These spiders had higher strength and constitution than her and were ranked above her as well. It was entirely possible that within those cocoons lurked the spider's offspring, not just the bodies of adventurers he was searching for. It was much safer for Rusty to climb the tree instead. His body was remarkably durable, and even if he were pierced by the spider's fangs, their venom would have no effect on him. "Don't look at me like that. How about this? Why don't you stick to my shoulder? If more spiders appear, we'll take them on together." After a back and forth, both of them agreed to climb it together. While Rusty's climbing skill wasn't good enough for dungeon walls, trees weren't as much of a problem. Rusty approached the base of the tree, his metallic fingers flexing as he tested the bark's grip. The wood gave a satisfying hold, and Gleam scurried back onto his shoulder, her silvery body shimmering faintly as she prepared to ascend with him. However, before advancing further, a shift in his body began taking place. His frame became elongated as he switched into his more dexterous form. Only then did their ascent begin. Rusty moved steadily, his iron frame making faint scraping noises against the bark. Gleam adjusted her stance, balancing on his shoulder, her antennae twitching at every distant sound. The hanging cocoons swayed closer with each step upward. The higher they climbed, the denser the webs became, but as expected, they lacked any toxins or stickiness. Gleam flicked her antenna toward a particularly large cocoon, her silent way of indicating their first target. Rusty nodded and adjusted his path. The cocoon was suspended from a thick branch, its silken strands anchored firmly to the surrounding foliage. As he reached out to examine it, the cocoon jerked slightly, sending a ripple through the nearby webs. Gleam froze, her body tense, and Rusty paused, his hand hovering mid-air. "Something's inside. Be ready." Alexander's voice echoed within his helmet as his right eye shone brightly with his light. "If it's alive, it might not be friendly." Rusty placed his foot on a sturdy branch and used his arm to steady himself against the large tree. With careful precision, he began cutting into the oversized cocoon using his sword. As the fibrous shell gave way, the contents were revealed, a humanoid figure trapped inside. However, the body was in a grim state, as numerous smaller spiders had already begun gnawing at it. The exposed hole allowed light to spill into the cocoon, prompting some of the spiders to scatter and attempt an escape. That was something Rusty couldn't permit. Classification: Minuscule giant forest spider G+. Type: Arachnoid. Rusty's skill identified these smaller arachnoid creatures as G-rank monsters, ones he could dispatch without much trouble. Though their size was smaller than that of Gleam's, they were still formidable, each about as large as a man's head. Rusty wasted no time. His sword flashed as he slashed at the retreating smaller spiders, cleaving through their webbing and fragile exoskeletons alike. Gleam sprang into action, her antennae glowing faintly. Instead of using her spells, she engaged the little monsters directly. She leaped forward, surprising Rusty, and ferociously bit the spiderlings to death. Her silvery carapace was quite resistant to the smaller monsters' bites, which allowed her to unleash her ant fury. It was quite the sight to watch Gleam ferociously tear through the G-rank spiders. Despite her small size, she moved with precision and speed, her mandibles crushing exoskeletons with ease. She leaped from one tiny spider to the next and made sure that none of them escaped. Rusty, on the other hand, focused intently on stabbing his sword into the cocoon, ensuring that whatever was inside didn't make it out alive. Eventually, the area was dripping with greenish liquid seeping from the monsters' bodies. "Remind me not to get on your bad side," he remarked while seeing all the severed bodies of the forest spiders. "Yes, I admit I underestimated you, but, are you okay?" Gleam tilted her head in confusion. Though the battle was over, Rusty noticed Gleam moving much slower than usual. She had been tearing through the spiders like a whirlwind but had inadvertently ingested some of the strange fluids they were composed of. "Ah, I think our Lady Gleam has overdone it. Don't worry, she'll just be out of commission for a minute or two. Those toxins usually wear off quickly." A burden chimed in as he also noticed that the effects of the paralyzing toxins were starting to take effect. Gleam on the other hand let out a pitiful groan. She stopped moving, clinging weakly to one of the larger branches. Her body felt stiff, the paralyzing toxin taking hold. Rusty chuckled softly, removing his helmet as he moved to help her. Gently, he picked her up and placed her inside his chest plate right through his exposed neck, then placed his helmet back on to safely lock her inside. "Don't worry, Gleam, you'll be safe in my body. Just rest for now." Gleam chirped softly, clearly embarrassed at what she had done. Rusty had designed his new body with a few specific features in mind, all stemming from his time spent trying to save his friend. The interior of his chest had been modified with care, a small metal shelf installed so Gleam could be secured and safe. She wouldn't slide into his legs or be harmed in transit. It was the perfect little hideaway, offering protection whenever she needed it. "I wonder, maybe if my body becomes larger, Gleam could stay inside and cast her spells from within?" Rusty asked, and Alexander was the first one to respond. "I suppose that could be a possibility, but perhaps we should first get through this first." Rusty nodded and used his sword to prod the spider cocoon, peeling it open for a closer look. With the spiders dead, he could finally examine the body inside. It was far from pretty, riddled with holes, the face half melted and partially devoured. He grimaced at the sight. If he ever tried using this body, anyone who saw his face would likely assume he was some kind of undead monster. "This one's a dud," he muttered to himself, moving on to the next cocoon. He hoped one of them might contain something viable, something he could actually use. However, neither of them contained any humans but regular animals instead. It seemed that he would need to move further into the forest and put himself in more peril before he would discover his new identity. This makes it. Fourth one. Before Rusty could count, the glowing black light in his eye socket replied to inform him about the number of spider lairs that they had inspected. He was in the process of descending from one of the trees, his iron frame clanking softly as he landed on the ground. It became clear that finding a usable body would not be a straightforward task. This was already the fourth attempt, yet the spider webs held nothing but half-eaten bodies, animal remains, and old skeletons. Rusty sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly as his metal limbs touched the ground. The forest seemed endless, and though his metal body granted him limitless endurance, the constant climbing and searching had taken its toll. Each failed attempt only deepened his frustration. "We're not making much progress here," Rusty muttered, resting his sword against his shoulder. Alexander's calm voice chimed in, steady as ever. "Patience, Rusty. The forest is vast. We'll find one eventually." A burden, on the other hand, was far less sympathetic. "Perhaps you're just unlucky. Or maybe the universe has a sense of humor. That would explain this predicament of mine." Rusty would have rolled his eyes, if he had any. Instead, he opened his chest plate briefly to check on Gleam. The little ant twitched slightly. She had recovered from the toxins but had, for some reason, become quite fond of the little hiding spot inside his chest. She had even asked if she could add softer materials, as though planning to build a nest of her own. Rusty had to remind her that when he swapped out his loadouts, the proposed nest would inevitably be destroyed. That had finally discouraged her, at least for now. Degree. Yeah, come to think of it, the day is ending, it will be hard to avoid those threads. Gleam mentioned the time of day, they had spent the entirety of it searching for a good replacement body. During the day, the spiders were far less active, relying more on their traps and nests for hunting. But as night descended, their behavior would change. They'd emerge in droves, actively hunting anything that wandered into their territory. The group had wandered deeper into their territory and the odds were turning against them. "We can't keep pushing forward in the dark. We need shelter." Rusty nodded, his iron form glinting faintly in the dimming light. "Let's find somewhere safe before it gets any worse. I can light the way." After reaching into his inventory, he pulled out a torch, its flame sputtering to life after some help from Gleam. With just a few sparks, the torch's flame sputtered to life and cast flickering shadows around the area. Gleam perched on his shoulder again, her antennae twitching nervously at every sound. Oh. "Don't worry, we'll be fine, we just need to find some temporary shelter." Rusty tried to reassure Gleam. He was a monster, one who didn't require sleep, and could easily stand guard through the entire night. Once daylight returned, they could resume their search for that elusive replacement body. He had to find one before they reached the next settlement. Still, Rusty knew the forest offered no guarantees. It was entirely possible they wouldn't find anything here, or worse, they might stumble into a dangerous situation. Yet, despite the odds, he wasn't in a hurry. Patience was a virtue his metal body afforded him, time was one of his allies, and with each slain spider, his experience points grew and he was one step closer to evolving. They moved carefully, the torchlight illuminating the dense forest but doing little to ease the creeping dread. The sound of skittering legs grew more frequent, accompanied by the occasional gleam of many eyes reflecting in the dark. More than once, the group was forced to fight off ambushes from smaller spiders, Rusty's sword and Gleam's magic keeping the group safe. However, it became clear that the attacks were increasing in frequency and ferocity. "If it wasn't for the silence spell, we might have been overrun by now, we have to find shelter somewhere and wait it out." Rusty was well aware of the dangers lurking in this forest, and his concern for his friend weighed heavily on him. As a living armor monster made of metal, he was something the spiders couldn't truly digest. Their only likely target was Gleam. The torch they carried allowed them to spot the nearly invisible threads and burn a path forward, but it also acted as a beacon, drawing the spiders closer with every passing moment. Rusty knew their current strategy wasn't sustainable. What they needed was shelter, somewhere safe to stay hidden and still in the darkness until daylight returned. Finally, they stumbled upon the entrance to a cave, its yawning mouth offering the promise of temporary safety. Rusty glanced back at the others. "This should do for now. We'll set up camp here and wait for morning." The group, comprising a suit of armor, an ant, and the two glowing orbs that served as Rusty's eyes, moved cautiously inside. Rusty's torch cast eerie, flickering shapes on the walls before he quickly extinguished the flame. Navigating in near total darkness posed no challenge for him as he had spent much of his existence in the dim confines of a dungeon. It seemed the webbing didn't extend this far. Perhaps this cave could serve as a safe haven for the night. The cave was dry, its jagged walls tapering inward the deeper they ventured, creating an oppressive yet secure barrier against the dangers outside. Rusty found a relatively flat section of the cavern floor where they could rest. Satisfied with the location, he sat down in silence, Gleam making her way inside of his chest again as they waited. "Are we just going to wait here until morning?" asked Aberdan, who seemed quite bored with the situation. "I suppose we will." "Well, that's rather boring." Rusty had taken to keeping his two guides summoned throughout the entire day and night cycle. After the initial summoning, his mana would gradually recharge, allowing them to remain with him indefinitely. Like Rusty, they didn't require sleep, food, or breaks. However, unlike him, they weren't as adept at staying occupied during long stretches of inactivity. Rusty could sit in complete silence for hours, unmoving and content. The two guides, on the other hand, seemed to thrive on finding ways to bicker with each other, filling the quiet with their ceaseless chatter. As the hours passed, the oppressive silence of the cave was broken only by the faint skittering of spiders outside. Occasionally, the group could hear the crunch of something being dragged across the ground, followed by the grotesque sound of flesh being torn. It was a grim reminder of the danger lurking just beyond the cavern's entrance. Rusty sat motionless, his iron frame blending seamlessly with the dim surroundings, while Gleam rested inside his chest plate, occasionally peeking out through the narrow gaps. Alexander and Aberdan floated inside his helmet, their glowing orbs casting faint light from within his eye sockets. "This is intolerable." Aberdan finally broke the silence. "Is there really nothing that we can do here? Why don't we move deeper into this cave? What if we find something there? We seem to be safe here. Why should we push our luck?" Alexander said, his tone laced with doubt as he questioned the sanity of such a decision. They were still surrounded by monsters, and without the constant use of the silencing spell, Rusty's clanking metal body would be discovered quickly. "If we rush out, we risk being surrounded and overwhelmed." "Bah, aren't you supposed to be the adventurer? Where is your adventurous spirit?" Aberdan interjected with his usual sarcasm. "It died when I did." Alexander replied dryly. "Yeah, they're quite the pair, aren't they?" Rusty said, directing his words toward Gleam. "Don't worry about them. Try to get some rest." Gleam, the only one in their group who actually needed sleep, had been snoozing inside Rusty's chest compartment off and on. She now seemed unusually alert, her small antennae twitching as her head poked out. Her tiny eyes scanned their surroundings while the others continued their bickering. "There's something there?" he asked while trying to look in the direction of where her antennae were pointing at. There he saw some strange markings on the ground. Once he focused more, he noticed that it looked similar to tracks left behind by the convoy of merchant carriages he was involved in recently. Rusty tilted his head, the glowing orbs in his helmet glowing brighter as he studied the tracks Gleam had pointed out. They were faint, etched into the dirt and stone floor of the cave, but unmistakably artificial. The distinct grooves, likely made by wheels, suggested recent passage. "Tracks? Here?" Aberdan, who was bored out of his mind, muttered, his interest showing. "Could there be other people here? Those tracks aren't too fresh, at least a few weeks old. They probably left already." Alexander responded to Aberdan's question almost instantly, attempting to dissuade Rusty from investigating further. He knew the Demon Lord all too well and suspected he'd try to convince Rusty to take unnecessary risks. Meanwhile, Rusty crouched closer to the faint tracks on the cavern floor, his metal fingers tracing the shallow grooves. He wasn't an experienced tracker, but the markings clearly led deeper into the cavern. Perhaps there was something worth discovering ahead. Wasn't this spider-infested forest supposed to be off-limits to merchants? Rusty muttered, suspicion creeping into his tone. He'd spent enough time around humanoids to know they rarely put themselves in danger willingly. Using roads to transport goods was the norm, venturing into a forest thick with spider webs was downright reckless. "It shouldn't be used, no," Aberdan replied, his voice laced with disdain. "But if cutting through it saves a few days of travel and spares them some toll fees? Greed makes people do stupid things. Sometimes it's not just greed," Alexander added, offering another perspective. "If someone's on the run, they might take a harder path to avoid pursuit. A forest full of spider monsters isn't just dangerous, it's a deterrent." perfect for evading anyone chasing them. Rusty considered this explanation as he straightened up, his glowing eyes fixed on the tracks. Whatever had happened here, it wouldn't make sense unless he investigated further. His curiosity was piqued, and despite Alexander's caution, he was already leaning toward delving deeper to uncover this mystery. The tracks could mean survivors, or worse, fresh danger. "We're going deeper," Rusty proclaimed in a resolute voice which caused his group to react in various ways. "Typical. Ha, I knew you couldn't resist." Gleam seemed eager to see what lay deeper inside, her antennae twitching with curiosity. Alexander, on the other hand, was clearly uneasy, while a Burden gloated, pleased that something intriguing might finally await them. With the decision made, the group moved cautiously further into the cave, using the tracks as their guide. Rusty led the way as Gleam perched comfortably on his shoulder. Her mana reserves had replenished, allowing her to recast her silencing spell to keep those metal joints silent. Could this be some kind of hidden shortcut? Alexander wondered. The walls, they look worked on by someone. Not natural. As they ventured deeper, it became clear he was right. What had seemed like a natural cave entrance gave way to a man-made tunnel. The walls had been deliberately enlarged, likely to allow larger objects or creatures to pass through. It could have been a mine. A Burden suggested a hint of greed in his tone. "What if we stumble upon gold or precious gems here?" "I doubt it," Alexander replied dismissively. "If there was anything valuable left, this place wouldn't have been abandoned so easily." "Sure, the spiders make it dangerous, but with enough investment, adventurers or soldiers could clear them out. There's probably nothing worthwhile inside. At most, this is an escape tunnel, something a noble or merchant had built to flee without being seen." "Why are you so sure?" "It could have been made by that thieves' guild of yours to smuggle goods. What if there are some hidden treasures inside?" Rusty listened silently, his thoughts focused on the tracks ahead. Whether it was treasure, danger, or merely an abandoned tunnel, there was only one way to find out: keep moving forward. The faint grooves of the tracks continued, winding further into the tunnel and occasionally intersecting with strange, shallow scrapes that seemed too irregular to be natural. Gleam perched attentively on his shoulder, her antennae twitching as her tiny eyes darted from one shadow to the next. A Burden's occasional mutterings of greed and speculation echoed faintly, while Alexander remained on watchful, ready to call out if he saw any danger. "Can you two quiet down? Something doesn't feel right here." The tracks they were following eventually led to a wider chamber, and the air grew heavier, carrying a faint, acrid scent of decay. Rusty's senses picked up a distant, rhythmic tapping sound that seemed to reverberate through the tunnel. It was faint but unnerving, like the slow march of a predator pacing just out of sight. He stopped before entering the chamber as he saw something inside. Several carriages, their frames webbed up in thick, silken threads, were scattered across the cavern. The carriages bore intricate designs that had long since dulled under layers of dust and cobwebs. Rusty approached the nearest one cautiously, his sword at the ready, while Gleam hopped off his shoulder to inspect the ground near the wheels. "Carriages. Multiple," Rusty muttered, his eyes scanning the chamber. This wasn't just a passing group. It was a convoy, like that one. They didn't just abandon their goods. Looks like there was a fight. Was it those spiders? The carriages were still loaded with boxes and various goods, though half were smashed or scattered. Something didn't add up. These merchants had made it this far, which meant they'd somehow handled the spiders outside, but here, they'd been overwhelmed. Those spiders hunted from treetops, ambushing was their way. They didn't nest in caves. So, what had drawn them here? Or was there something more at play? "It's okay, Gleam, stay calm." Gleam scurried back to his shoulder after a quick survey of the ground, her delicate antennae twitching in erratic, agitated movements. Rusty reached up instinctively, offering a reassuring pat to calm her. But her unease mirrored his own, and for good reason. There was something here, lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting. The air felt heavier now, a faint weight of danger pressing against his senses. The devastation around them told a grim story. Whoever, or whatever, had done this was strong enough to annihilate an entire merchant caravan. Half-crushed crates, spilled goods, and shattered wheels lay scattered like broken bones in a graveyard. The question gnawed at his mind: was the creature still here? If it was, had it already spotted them? And was he strong enough to beat it? Rusty's iron frame remained perfectly still as he scanned the chamber, his glowing eyes dimming as they swept across the remnants of the caravan. The rhythmic tapping sound in the distance grew louder, carrying an ominous weight. It wasn't random, there was intent in the sound, as though whatever made it wanted to be heard, or was too large to move silently. Stay sharp, something's alive in here and it might be responsible for. Alexander commented, his voice more of a whisper. Gleam chirped softly, moving onto her usual perch on his shoulder. She didn't speak, but her silence spoke volumes. Even the usually boisterous Aberdan refrained from his usual sarcasm, knowing well that if Rusty died, then so would he. The tapping grew closer, its echoes amplifying in the cavernous space. The acrid stench of decay intensified, and Rusty's grip on his sword tightened. He shifted into a defensive stance, preparing for the worst. Then it appeared. Out of the darkness, something enormous moved into the torchlight's faint glow. The rhythmic tapping ceased as it stepped fully into view, an undead spider monster of grotesque proportions. Its once chitinous exoskeleton now bore the rotting marks of decay, webbed with necrotic veins glowing faintly green. 8 skeletal legs, jagged and splintered, scraped the ground as it moved, leaving faint trails of black pus. The spider's eyes were hollow, pits of greenish light that flickered like dying embers. On its back, webbing pulsated grotesquely, as though something alive and unspeakable squirmed beneath the surface. What's a corrupted arachnid doing in a place like this? Alexander whispered as if afraid the monster might notice, even though he knew no one could hear him conversing with Rusty. Rusty, on the other hand, remained calm. Instead of succumbing to fear, he used his identification skill to determine what kind of monster they were up against. There was still time to retreat, the monstrosity stood motionless, not yet lunging forward. When the classification appeared, it confirmed that Rusty was in over his head. However, there was one small detail suggesting he wasn't entirely out of options. Classification: Corruptor Arachnid D. Type: Undead/Arachnoid. Description: A corrupted giant spider reanimated by dark necrotic magic. Its decaying body serves as a vessel for absorbed victims that are forced into its hollow husk. The corruptor arachnid is highly aggressive and unpredictable, capable of infecting its victims with necrotic webbing that paralyzes and weakens them before assimilation. Known for its durability and venomous attacks, it preys indiscriminately. Rusty could see the mentioned absorbed victims sticking out of its abdomen. He was a monster who lacked a sense of disgust by Alexander was being quite vocal about it. Arms, legs and even faces were pushing out of its rear end. It was as if the monster fused bodies onto itself, creating a grotesque patchwork of torsos and limbs, their mouths frozen in silent screams. Degree. Gleam's antennae twitched violently at the sight of the monster. As an F-rank creature, she found an entity 2 whole ranks above her utterly terrifying. Rusty wasn't much better off, being only an E-rank himself. Winning this battle seemed almost impossible. Yet, he wasn't backing away. There was a reason for that. By some stroke of luck, this monster might actually be something he could handle, despite its higher rank. Feeling adventurous, Rusty? What are you planning to do with those? Aberdan remarked, watching the living armor rummage through his inventory before equipping a bow and arrow. The monster's body, a chitinous arachnid form, appeared impervious to physical blows. Its undead nature only made it more daunting, allowing it to fight on even without a head or brain. Unless Rusty could locate and destroy the corrupted core within, the monster would likely continue to fight relentlessly. I might be able to win. You might be able to win? I'm not sure if we should be doing something on a hunch. Alexander retorted, his gaze fixed on the stationary target. The monster didn't seem to react to their presence, likely because Rusty was a monster himself, a living armor, not truly alive. Undead creatures were notorious for their hatred of the living, driven by an insatiable hunger to attack anything with a life force. Rusty's unique nature as a non-living construct granted him a brief advantage, but it wasn't one he could depend on for long. Rusty knocked an arrow and drew the bowstring, the metal of his fingers creaking slightly. He aimed carefully, his glowing eye sockets seemingly narrowing as he searched for the creature's weak point. The corrupted core was likely hidden deep within its body, but he had a theory based on the necrotic veins pulsing across its decayed frame. The glowing green lines converged around its abdomen, which consisted of a grotesque mass of fused victims and writhing webbing. It should be somewhere around there, right? He wasn't quite sure about his theory, but he was willing to give it a try. His situation looked dire, but there were still several ways for him to survive. Previously he had noted a few smaller openings in the walls, ones that a Gleamnig ant wearing a mini tourist helmet could fit through. If all seemed lost, he was willing to retreat to hide. However, he did have one big trump card against this monster, and that was his light elemental skill. The projectile whistled through the air, glowing brightly white, and struck the monster's abdomen. It struck the monster's abdomen with a sickening thud, embedding itself deeply into the writhing, grotesque mass. A ripple of energy surged through the creature's form, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, a small radiant explosion took hold and the monster screamed. The sound wasn't like anything Rusty had heard before. It was a layered echo, a mix of the shrill cries of the absorbed victims and a guttural, inhuman roar. The spider's massive body twitched violently, and its skeletal legs scraped against the ground, sending shards of stone scattering. The corrupted green veins across its body pulsed brighter, radiating a sickly glow as it turned its hollow gaze directly toward Rusty. So much for the element of surprise. Alexander muttered. Nice shot, but I think you just made it angry. Aberdan added with a dry chuckle while the undead spider charged. Its skeletal legs propelled it forward with a terrifying speed, but there was something that he noticed, a limp. The light elemental arrow that he had used had done more damage than he initially thought. The corruptor arachnid's movements were erratic, and its right side lagged slightly, as though one of its legs had been weakened by the blast. Rusty quickly nocked another arrow, his focus sharp as he prepared to exploit the weakness. The chamber shook as the arachnid's charge reverberated through the ground. Rusty sidestepped just in time as the creature's massive legs smashed into the stone floor where he'd stood moments earlier. The impact sent debris flying, forcing Gleam to cling tightly to his shoulder. Hang on tight, Gleam! Rusty sprinted to gain distance, his heavy iron body eerily silent thanks to Gleam's spell. He kept his focus on the creature, firing another light-infused arrow into its side. Normally it would be impossible to harm this creature with his regular iron arrows, however it was luckily a monster type that was undead, something that his light elemental was highly effective against. The second arrow struck true, burying itself in the creature's flank and unleashing another burst of radiant energy. The undead arachnid howled again, its twisted legs faltering as the necrotic veins along its abdomen began to dim. The light elemental damage was clearly taking its toll, and the creature's movements grew more erratic. Yet, it was far from defeated. The corrupted arachnid retaliated, spewing forth a torrent of webbing from its distended abdomen. The strands glowed faintly green, pulsating with strange evil energy. Rusty dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding the sticky mass as it splattered against the cavern wall, hissing and smoking as it corroded the stone. That stuff looks nasty. Aberdan remarked while looking at the stones melting. You better not let that touch you. I'd hate to see you end up part of its collection. Rusty ignored the Demon Lord's commentary, focusing instead on the battle. Though he had some spare iron to restore his body, the net posed a big obstacle to his escape. It appeared to have both acidic and sticky properties, getting entangled in it could spell his defeat. One wrong move could end everything, as this was the stark difference in strength between him and a being a full rank above his. The corrupted arachnid reared back, its skeletal legs scraping against the cavern floor in frustration. Despite being an undead monster, it seemed to possess a mind that could feel rage. It continuously attempted to shoot Rusty down with its webbing, but he used the environment to his advantage. Large stalagmites provided good cover, and scattered boxes left behind by the merchants offered temporary protection, able to withstand at least one hit. However, the chamber was steadily becoming enshrouded in corrosive webbing. If he took too long, he would eventually be left with no choice but to move forward. Are you sure? That could be dangerous. Gleam chirped from the sidelines as she leapt onto the wall. She seemed to have a plan and quickly skittered away in the opposite direction. Meanwhile, Rusty continued pelting the monster with arrows from a relatively safe distance. To his dismay, the arrows were far less effective than he had anticipated. The simple undead he'd faced in the dungeons before had been purified outright by his attacks, but this creature wasn't. Perhaps it was due to the difference in ranks or its monstrous spider body. Regardless, he pressed on, losing arrows until his mana reserves dwindled, leaving him with little to sustain his skill. It's still not dead, Rusty. Perhaps a retreat is in order. Aberdan's tone carried a note of skepticism. The monster had lost a significant amount of health, its body riddled with holes and several limbs missing. Yet, it remained standing, still capable of fighting. No, we'll stick to Gleam's plan. Rusty replied firmly, determination etched on his face. The Demon Lord remained silent, suppressing the urge to comment on the absurdity of the situation. His advice had been cast aside in favor of an ant's whimsical deliberations, a notion he found both frustrating and deeply amusing. Rusty, on the other hand, activated one of his loadouts, shifting into his largest and sturdiest form. His body expanded, reinforced with thick armor, and a massive tower shield materialized in his grasp. He braced himself, fully aware of the risk, but resolved to trust in his friend's plan. "Here I am! Come at me," he shouted, his voice echoing through the cavern. He struck his shield with his sword, the sharp clang reverberating as he aimed to draw the monster's attention. Everything hinged on it targeting him directly, buying Gleam the time she needed. The corrupted arachnid's glowing, hollow gaze snapped to Rusty, and its massive body lurched forward, propelled by its remaining legs. Rusty stood his ground, gripping his shield tightly as the monster charged. With a roar of fractured, otherworldly voices, it launched a barrage of glowing green webs. They splattered against Rusty's massive shield, hissing and smoking but failing to penetrate the dense iron plating. The shield was doing its job. The webs couldn't trap him, and the monster's attacks, though relentless, were absorbed by the bulk of the shield's enchanted structure. As the creature closed the gap, its legs crashed against Rusty's barrier, causing vibrations to echo through the cavern. Yet, he held it together, and with his weight increasing to cover for the lack of mass, he was successful in stopping this maddened charge. The spider reared back, the part of the spider in front gnashing its fangs as it got ready to attack again. But that's when Gleam made her move. Leaping from a hidden crevice above, the glowing ant hurtled down, her tiny form landing deftly on the monster's grotesque, pulsating back. Her antennae twitched as she channeled her mana, the glow around her intensifying. "Now, Gleam!" Rusty shouted. Gleam's tiny frame shone like a star in the dim cavern as she unleashed her healing spell, the same one she had learned in that cult's underground dungeon. The spell wasn't meant to heal in this case. Against the undead, its effects were devastating. Once activated, it rippled through the creature's entire body, causing it to freeze in place. The spider let out a screech that pierced the air, its voice a chorus of tortured souls as the radiant light spread through its body. The necrotic veins pulsing across its exoskeleton began to disintegrate, unraveling into ash. The writhing mass of absorbed victims fused to its abdomen and writhed in agony before fading into wisps of green mist, their tormented souls finally freed. The spell tore through its form, disrupting its very essence and leaving it paralyzed, vulnerable to Rusty's next move. Rusty didn't waste a moment. With the corrupted arachnid frozen in agony, he dropped his shield and drew his longsword, its blade starting to gleam with a radiant glow. The weapon wasn't particularly special, but with his elemental skill, it was more than enough to finish this creature off. He thrust the blade forward, driving it deep into the monster's spidery head. Once embedded, he unleashed all of his remaining mana. The monster lit up from within, its dark, necrotic veins seared away by the purifying light. It shrieked again, a horrifying sound that echoed through the battlefield, still not dead, even with the blade buried in what should have been its cranium. Its core remained intact, hidden somewhere deep within its monstrous form. The creature thrashed violently, slamming into Rusty. He summoned every ounce of strength and discharged his final elemental skill. With one last desperate effort, he drove the blade even deeper. The monster resisted fiercely, spewing corrosive webbing that splattered across his body, burning through his plated armor. Even though his body sizzled, he refused to relent, and finally, it was over. The monstrous spider's legs collapsed beneath its massive weight, and its enormous body fell to the ground with a deafening thud. Its hollow eyes dimmed, the eerie green glow extinguished forever. "I'm fine, Gleam, don't worry." His body was still sizzling from the webbing, one of his legs had fallen off, as had his left arm. Luckily, he did not have any internal organs. As long as his helmet and the core inside it remained intact, he could not be killed. Now that the battle was over, he heard the message confirming that he had leveled up. Gleam had leveled up as well, and it seemed she was now ready to advance to a new evolutionary stage, one that would likely allow her to reach the next rank. The dim cavern finally fell silent, save for the faint crackling of web remnants still dissolving into nothingness. Rusty surveyed the battlefield, his glowing eyes sweeping over the fallen arachnid's massive form. The air still reeked of decay, but as a being without a nose it didn't bother him much. Instead, he focused on assessing the aftermath. Pieces of the corrupted arachnid were strewn across the cavern floor, faintly steaming where the radiant energy had burned away its necrotic magic. The once formidable monster, a whole rank above him, now lay in pieces. Its grotesque abdomen was partially reduced to ash, its limbs sprawled lifelessly like shattered branches. "Well, Rusty." A burden broke the silence, as the quartet looked over the battlefield. "Congratulations on not dying, Luckily all this noise didn't attract the other spiders, otherwise we would be in trouble. The monsters outside the cave seemed too afraid to peek inside. The reason likely had something to do with the D-rank monster. Rusty assumed they were hesitant to enter its territory, similar to the group of insectoid monsters he had encountered back in the dungeon. Those monsters, too, avoided invading each other's personal space, at least until he disrupted the balance and, with Gleam's help, eventually killed them all. Degree. You've managed to reach level 10. Rusty ignored a burden and focused on his friend Gleam. A quick glance at her status screen confirmed it, she had reached level 10. This meant she could undergo another evolution. The realization prompted him to check his own status, though killing the monster hadn't been enough to push him to the next milestone. It had, however, rewarded him with multiple levels. Now at level 13, he was less than 2 levels away from returning to the Soul Forge. That's great. I wonder what the choices will be. Gleam was clearly thrilled with her progress, she had been stuck in F rank for far too long. Just as before, Rusty could review her evolutionary possibilities. This time, though, a burden and Alexander were also present to offer their advice. Although the battle had just ended, they appeared to be safe for the moment. Rusty turned his attention to Gleam's display to examine the possibilities for her evolution. Lesser Horned Myrm Ant Queen. Insectoid E. A rarer horned variant of the lesser queen of the Myrm ant species. Once fully grown, it becomes immobile to focus solely on producing offspring. Lesser Mana Myrm Ant Soldier. Insectoid E. A larger, magical variant of the lesser Myrm Ant Soldier. While its body is only slightly larger, its carapace shines with magical energy, and it can cast low-level spells. Magical Gleaming Ant. Insectoid E+. A direct evolution of the rare lesser magical Gleaming Ant. This monster prioritizes enhanced magical attacks, featuring an increased body size to accommodate its heightened mana pool. Small silvery magical Gleaming Ant. Insectoid E. A direct evolution of the lesser silvery magical Gleaming Ant. While its size remains the same, its magical abilities are further enhanced by its special mana-absorbing body. Oh! I can see the monster ranks now. Rusty quickly ruled out the first option, turning Gleam into a queen. That path was incompatible with their goals. The soldier variant also posed a challenge since neither he nor Gleam wanted her to increase in size significantly. This narrowed the choices to two, an enhanced version of her current form or a seemingly stronger evolution that could potentially push her to a rank higher than Rusty's own. Having Gleam reach the pinnacle of E rank was an enticing prospect, but Rusty knew he needed to weigh the options carefully. Gleam's next evolution could greatly impact their synergy as a team. Keeping her in her current smaller form was undeniably more convenient. However, this was a harsh world, and survival for two weak monsters was difficult. Even a simple undead spider could kill them both if they didn't possess a direct counter like his elemental skills. Rusty turned to his companions for advice, hoping their insights might help clarify the decision. What do you think about these choices? A burden was the first to respond. Well, Rusty, if you're asking me, I'd say the magical Gleaming Ant sounds like the most versatile choice. Bigger mana pool, stronger magical attacks, it's a solid step up without completely changing her nature. What we need for survival is more immediate power. As expected, a burden prioritized survival above all else, choosing the highest ranked option. Alexander on the other hand believed that they should go for the other choice. I agree it sounds promising, but you shouldn't dismiss the small silvery magical Gleaming Ant. Its mana-absorbing body sounds promising, and she will retain her smaller size. Staying inconspicuous could be just as important for us in the long run. Rusty nodded. Both suggestions had merit, and he turned his attention to Gleam. She chirped excitedly, her antennae twitching with eagerness. What do you think, Gleam? In the end, this choice is yours to make. There were pros and cons to both choices, but he wanted her to be the one to pick it. She heard what the two guides had said, so now she just needed to make up her mind. Gleam paused, her small body trembling with anticipation as her glowing eyes darted between Rusty and the monstrous remnants of the corrupted arachnid. After a moment of reflection, she chirped decisively and pointed one delicate antenna towards one side, indicating that she wished to become the small silvery magical Gleaming Ant. I think that's the right choice for you, Gleam. Rusty nodded, the movement of his iron helmet reflecting his agreement. Gleam's choice made sense. While the allure of immediate power was tempting, they needed to think about the bigger picture. Choosing a lower-ranked evolution wasn't necessarily a setback, it opened the door to more future options. Though it meant they'd have to kill more monsters to reach higher levels, it also increased the likelihood of unlocking better evolutionary variants down the line. In this world, the requirements for evolution were hidden and often influenced by luck. Both he and Gleam were anomalies, miracles in their own right. The fact that they had come this far was nothing short of astonishing. Under normal circumstances, a gleaming ant like Gleam would have perished in her nest, never amounting to more than another casualty. Likewise, Rusty should have remained a soulless, mindless piece of living armor, trapped forever in that dungeon. All right, if that's what you want, then let's go for it. Rusty nodded, affirming Gleam's choice. He selected the evolution path for her, and a soft light enveloped her form. However, as expected, not much of a change occurred immediately, her transformations were always gradual. Instead, Gleam began to feel drowsy, needing a safe place to complete her evolution. To accommodate her, Rusty removed his helmet, allowing Gleam to climb into his body, which was currently in its enlarged form. Even if she grew slightly during the process, he'd still be able to contain her inside, keeping her safe from any lurking spiders or other threats. Hop in, Gleam. Gleam responded with a cheerful nod and skittered up Rusty's leg. She squeezed into his body through the neck area, settling inside before he placed his helmet back on. Based on past experiences, Rusty estimated it would take a few hours for her transformation to complete, likely until morning. With Gleam slumbering safely inside, Rusty turned his attention to other matters. He needed to examine the undead spider's lair and its remains. To his surprise, the spider's body contained several parts that might prove useful. Do you think I could use one of these, instead? He questioned both his guides as he approached the defeated spider monster. While parts of its body had disintegrated from the holy energy, a large portion remained intact. His attention was drawn to the grotesque remnants of human limbs, heads, and torsos fused into the corrupted arachnid's body. Rusty inspected these with a mix of curiosity and intent. Rusty had been searching for a new body to help him blend in among humanoids. While there wasn't a complete body here, he wasn't certain he needed one. A torso with a head might suffice, or perhaps even just the head. He'd simply need to adjust his armor to ensure it stayed in place. Ah, I see. Well, in theory, the possession skill should work on just a head. And there are a few to choose from here. Aberdan confirmed, but Alexander was slightly more skeptical. You want to use these half-eaten faces? Most of them are missing their eye sockets. People will think that you're a monster. I am a monster though. Rusty replied with a chuckle as he picked out one of the heads. The tongue lolled awkwardly, and one side of the face was nearly caved in, revealing bone beneath patches of decayed flesh. Even for his standards, this one seemed impractical. I probably can't use this one. After admitting that Alexander might be right, he tossed the head aside. Once on the ground it cracked and turned into particles of dust. He moved on to another potential candidate. This one was marginally better. Its face was mostly intact, though the expression was locked in a growl of horror. Rusty turned it over in his hands, considering how it might look once attached to his body. This one isn't the worst, but will my face be stuck like this? Potentially, the possession skill has its limits. Aberdan replied while Rusty continued sifting through the pile of limbs and heads. Although there were a few promising options among them, he wasn't limited to just these choices. This entire area was the spider's lair, and deeper within, there might be other hidden treasures waiting to be discovered. After carefully salvaging 3 heads, Rusty turned his attention to the wreckage of the merchant convoy. Perhaps among the scattered debris, he could find something useful to aid him on his newfound adventure. Soon he trudged over to the remnants of the merchant caravan, his heavy footsteps clanking against the stone floor. The area was littered with broken wooden crates, splintered barrels, and various other discarded wares that bore the marks of neglect and decay. Many items were reduced to little more than debris, their value long eroded by the damp and the presence of the monstrous arachnid. Still, there was a faint hope that something of importance might remain. The first thing Rusty noticed as he sifted through the wreckage was the unmistakable stench of death. Even though he lacked a nose, the presence of decomposing remains was tangible. More corpses lay scattered among the ruins, some mutilated beyond recognition, while others appeared to have been partially consumed. Rusty grimaced as he nudged a body aside with his boot, careful not to disturb it too much. Amid the grim scene, he stumbled across a satchel that had been hidden beneath a partially collapsed wagon. The leather bag was soaked and rotting, but its contents appeared mostly intact. Inside, Rusty found a bundle of documents, surprisingly well preserved and only stained by dried blood. These look important. The first document appeared to be a roster, listing the names of the caravan's crew and passengers. Several names were circled, accompanied by brief annotations: apprentice blacksmith, merchant's heir, retired adventurer. Rusty's gaze lingered on the entry for the blacksmith apprentice. The name was somewhat visible and there was even a small description next to it, a distinctive scar on his left cheek. Rusty's gaze shifted to the heads he had salvaged earlier. One of them bore the same scar. Could that be him? This was exactly what he needed, an identity to blend in with the locals. The man had been an apprentice blacksmith, an occupation Rusty could relate to in a way. He had no idea how long the bodies had been lifeless, but once he activated his possession skill, it might be possible to measure it from his memories. His guides had already warned him against possessing individuals with high-profile backgrounds or known family connections. If a sibling or relative of the deceased were to suddenly show up, his entire disguise could be compromised. Fortunately, when it came to blacksmiths and other common folk, few people paid much attention. He could always claim to be someone with a coincidentally similar name and profession if questioned. Rusty held up the scarred head, his glowing eyes scanning its lifeless features. It was eerily intact. Aside from some minor bruises, if the possession skill worked as intended, he'd gain not only control of the head but perhaps snippets of its former owner's memories, enough to convincingly mimic the apprentice blacksmith's persona. All right, this one will do for now. Let's see what else I can find here. The trip into the forest had been successful, he now possessed half of the puzzle. All that remained was to find the adventurer persona he needed. However, upon examining the two remaining heads and cross-referencing them with the documents, it became clear that neither was suitable. A shame. One belongs to the merchant heir, and the other to a criminal. It's better if we don't use them, Rusty remarked to Burden, whose quick reading skills came in handy once more. The first head belonged to a criminal slave who had been in transport. Assuming the identity of a slave was out of the question for obvious reasons. The second, that of the young merchant heir, was equally unsuitable as he was far too young and almost certainly too well known. With that, he placed the head into his inventory, ensuring it wouldn't decompose further. The arachnid's body had somehow preserved the flesh of its victims, but now that the creature was dead, the natural process of decay had resumed. After securing the head, he returned to scouring the caravan, hoping to uncover more useful items. Among the wreckage, he found a pouch containing several gold coins and a few steel weapons that had survived intact. Toward the back of the ruins, Rusty came across a partially intact crate bearing a merchant's emblem. Inside, he discovered an assortment of tools, likely belonging to the apprentice merchant whose head he now possessed. His search continued as he tried to gather anything he could sell later, but regretfully most items had been destroyed. After a few hours, the cavern brightened with the first light of dawn. Rusty finally stepped back, surveying his findings. Gleam's transformation continued inside him and it seemed to have started to conclude. He had a head to blend in with, some gold for trade, and a small stash of supplies. Although he was still missing an adventurer, he was a big step closer to his goal. Name: Gleam. Classification: Small silvery magical gleaming ant E, L1. Type: Insectoid. Hit points HP: 101/101. Magic points MP: 151/151. Stamina points SP: 112/112. Strength: 2E. Agility: 11E. Dexterity: 9E. Constitution: 2E. Intelligence: 17E. Wisdom: 11E. Willpower: 8E. Durability: E. All of the stats went up. The difference in ranks is truly staggering. It's a miracle I managed to win against that monster at my current rank. Rusty thought to himself as he examined Gleam's new stats. She had just evolved into an E- monster, and both her health and magic points had increased significantly. Recalling his own stats from the same rank, he noticed that his body started with higher HP but a lower amount of MP than hers. However, not everything could be boiled down to numbers. His durability was far greater than that of most monsters he had encountered. Additionally, size and skills played a crucial role, often enabling bursts of power that surpassed the raw stats on display. Gleam had climbed out of his metal body by now and was looking at her reflection in a puddle of water. She had changed slightly, her carapace had become sleeker and seemed to shimmer in the faint light. Her antennae were longer, more finely tapered, and pulsing faintly with a silvery glow. The transformation had left her with a more elegant and agile appearance, retaining her compact size while amplifying her magical prowess. She tested her agility by darting back and forth with sharp, precise movements, chirping happily as she adjusted to her new form. With her evolution she had also acquired some new skills. One was the previously mentioned body that apparently absorbed the ambient mana in the surroundings. Basic Mana Body L1. Passive skill. Allows the user to absorb mana in the surroundings, increasing their passive mana regeneration by 15%. In short, it was a skill that increased her passive mana regeneration, allowing her to regain MP faster. Unlike a trait, it was a skill, meaning it could be leveled up likely by casting more spells and continuously regenerating her magical energy. However, this wasn't the only skill she had acquired, there was another as well. Basic L1. Active skill. Enhances running speed, allowing the user to run faster than they normally should. Lesser Ray of Light. Spell. A simple spell that generates a blinding ray of light. Lesser Shield of Light. Spell. A simple spell that generates a shield of light that can both absorb physical and non-physical damage. Besides some new skills, she had also gained 2 new spells. One allowed her to create a barrier around her body, that could both deflect blows from weapons but also other spells. He had seen her generate it a few moments ago, illuminating the whole cavern with her light. Degree. Soon, a beam of light erupted from her mouth as she tested the second spell. The spell produced a bright white beam that shot out with incredible speed, traveling far before colliding with a wall and causing moderate damage. It appeared slightly more powerful than a mana bolt spell but consumed more than twice the amount of mana. While it seemed that its only use would be against undead monsters, it could also be charged for a prolonged period, giving it some damage potential. However, this prolonged use had a downside as Gleam's excitement was short-lived. Moments later, she collapsed to the ground, her mana pool completely drained from using the spell. He chuckled softly and brought over the mana-infused water they had left over from the goblin shaman. "I know you're happy, Gleam, but you really need to learn to conserve your mana." She looked briefly crestfallen but perked up quickly after sipping the revitalizing water. Rusty watched as Gleam gleefully bounced around after recovering her mana. Her newfound agility and magical prowess would certainly come in handy during their adventures. Her evolution had clearly reinvigorated her, and Rusty couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. He felt like a big brother watching his little sister taking a giant leap in life. Now that both of them were ranks, they could tackle bigger and badder foes. The cavern now felt less oppressive with the monster gone and the morning light filtering faintly through the cracks above. Yet, Rusty knew this was just the beginning. Their journey to survive, evolve, and eventually reach the top was just beginning. From what he knew, no one could truly claim that they were strong until they at least reached the B rank, and he wasn't even close. "All right, Gleam, let's gather up what we can and get moving. This place might not stay safe for long." Rusty is right. Once those forest spiders realize that this one is now dead, they might flood this cavern, but while we are here, why don't I propose something? A burden commented as his black orb shone brighter in Rusty's eye socket. "What is it?" "Those merchants probably came here for a reason, do you agree?" Sure." Rusty nodded, ensuring he had gathered everything worthwhile and stored it in his inventory system. The process had drained his SP, rendering him unable to switch loadouts for at least the next hour. "Well, I'm sure if we head there, we'll reach our destination faster. And now that we have the blacksmith's head, why don't we just move along?" Their purpose for venturing into this dangerous, spider-infested forest was to find a proper body for Rusty's metallic form. The blacksmith's head was already stored in his inventory, and he needed a few more moments to recharge enough SP to retrieve it. Rusty still hadn't delved into the memories of the man he intended to impersonate. But what about the adventurer? Wouldn't it be better to search the forest a little more? "Bah, we can find a dead adventurer somewhere else. The world is riddled with them." It was clear that a burden didn't want to linger in the forest any longer. He wasn't wrong, finding a dead adventurer to inhabit wouldn't be too difficult. If none were available, they could always target a living one. However, Rusty knew Alexander would be firmly against harming the living. Still, with the blacksmith's persona, Rusty could likely begin building his lair. They had collected some gold and items during their journey, which could be used to purchase a building and convert it into a smithy as his cover. Money, the driving force behind all humanoids, was a concept Rusty didn't fully grasp but found undeniably useful. With his skills, he had numerous ways to earn money, and through wealth, he could acquire the materials needed to enhance his arsenal and grow stronger. What do you think, Gleam? I see. Rusty nodded at Gleam's nonchalant response. She didn't seem to care whether they stayed or moved on, her focus was entirely on her new evolution. Even now she was looking at her own reflection, seemingly entranced by the sleekness of her new body. He needed to make a decision, and to be honest, he wasn't keen on scouring the forest for more bodies. The process was inefficient, and it didn't yield much experience either. Rusty was close to reaching level 15, the cap for E rank. There was also the possibility that more dangerous monsters lurked deeper in the forest. Defeating another undead spider or something similarly challenging would accelerate his progression toward his next evolution. It could be dangerous inside. Yes, but it could shorten our journey exponentially. I'm getting bored of this forest. Aberdan responded to Alexander with a hint of irritation. It seemed that he wasn't too fond of this place and perhaps he wished to return to a place with a speck of civilization. In the past he was a great demon lord, a king that had it all. The things that Rusty was doing would be tasks given to the lowest of demonic soldiers and perhaps he disliked the idea that he was now such a lowly being. Well, perhaps there are more valuable things further inside, it wouldn't be bad to get more gold. All right, Aberdan. Let's follow the path the merchants wanted to take. Rusty nodded and made sure that he had everything that he wanted from this place as it was time to move on. Gleam was still bouncing around testing her newly gained agility. However, once she saw him moving further towards the tunnels she quickly skittered after him and perched herself on his shoulder just like she did in her previous form. The moment she did, Rusty noted that her weight had slightly increased probably due to a sturdier carapace. With their course set, Rusty led the way deeper into the tunnel, his glowing eyes casting a faint light in the dim cavern. Gleam perched on his shoulder for a better view, her antennae twitching in rhythm with her excitement. The carved tunnel showed clear signs of human activity, smoothened walls, discarded tools, and even a few remnants of torches long since extinguished. It wasn't just a natural pathway, someone had deliberately created it. I bet those sneaky humans used this tunnel for smuggling. Aberdan said with a sly chuckle. Smuggling? Rusty asked, his curiosity piqued, as Aberdan sniggered inside his helmet. Think about it. Why else would someone go to such lengths to create a tunnel like this? Rusty was still new to this world, but he had already learned one thing, merchants couldn't be trusted. They always seemed to offer him the worst deals possible, and he was certain he'd lost a large amount of gold while bartering with them. At that time he needed all the money he could get to save Gleam, something a few merchants noticed and abused. What could it have been? Drugs? Slaves? Perhaps even some forbidden demonic items? I wonder, who is the true demon here? Alexander remained silent, offering no input. His grumbling, however, betrayed his irritation. The former champion of humanity clearly didn't want to admit that the people he had once sworn to protect could engage in treachery akin to that of demons. However, as they passed further it became more obvious that the demon lord had been correct. Looks like a dagger wound, not one caused by a monster. They must have killed him and discarded the remains. Perhaps they left him here as a warning. Along the way, they had stumbled upon a half-decomposed skeleton slumped against one of the tunnel walls. It was likely someone who had met their end during a journey. Aberdan, intrigued, observed that this might have been someone who defied the merchants, perhaps a slave or an individual who opposed their ways. Whoever it was, they had been killed here and left to rot. Perhaps, could this be the source? Aberdan muttered in a somewhat contemplative tone. Did you realize something? Rusty asked, noticing the shift in Aberdan's demeanor. Well, the bodies of the recently deceased tend to attract monsters. Those who die with strong resentment generate a great deal of malevolent energy, enough to lure undead creatures. Would one dead body be enough? Perhaps not, but... They continued to walk and soon they discovered another secret of this place, more bodies than they had previously expected. The tunnel stretched on, revealing a grim tapestry of death. Skeletons lay in varying states of decay, some crumpled as if they had fallen where they stood, while others were bound with rusted chains that had fused to the walls. These were no ordinary casualties of war or disease, they were prisoners, discarded slaves, and nameless souls who had been left to rot. Rusty knelt by one of the skeletons, his metallic hand brushing against the brittle bones. Many bore deep scars, some inflicted by blades, others by instruments of torture. It was clear that whoever had perished here had done so in agony. No wonder that creature was attracted to this palace. Alexander commented as he examined the discarded bodies. In this world, the undead were a grim reality, and some people failed to understand that leaving unpurified bodies exposed could attract vile creatures. On the wall behind the corpses, etched symbols began to draw their attention. Though distorted by claw marks, it wasn't difficult to piece the design together. The Thieves' Guild. Rusty remarked as he was a member himself, he still carried his coin emblem as proof of his ties. Slowly, they were unraveling the dark truth about this place. Perhaps the blacksmith, who had unwittingly ventured into these tunnels, would have faced a grim future, enslaved or worse had he not fallen prey to the arachnid. I see. Quite clever. They probably rounded up unsuspecting commoners and turned them into slaves. No one would dare bother them in a forest teeming with monster spiders. Oberton sounded as if he was complimenting this group. Alexander on the other hand was disgusted. Is this what their new world order looks like? Do they even care? Rusty wasn't sure what his guide was talking about, but it seemed to have something to do with his old friends. He wanted to ask Alexander to elaborate on his thoughts, but suddenly, he noticed something. The group's exploration of the tunnel took a dire turn as the air grew heavier, the scent of decay had become intense, making Gleam shiver in fright. My life detection skill isn't picking up anything, but would it react to dead corpses? Suddenly, the faint scraping of bone against stone echoed through the passage. Rusty halted, raising a metallic hand to calm his friend down. Gleam's antennae twitched, her light spell illuminating the way forward. They saw it, a skeleton shifting, its bony fingers clattering against the ground. One by one, other skeletons began to stir, an eerie green glow igniting in their eye sockets. Are they coming to life? The bodies they had passed were beginning to reanimate. A surge of greenish energy pulsed through the area as a strange phenomenon took hold. While Rusty had experience with dungeon-born monsters, this was something new. His metallic fingers tightened into fists as the skeletons began to rise. Each lifeless body moved with the same eerie green energy, the glow flickering like ghostly flames in their hollow eye sockets. Rusted weapons, still clutched in bony hands, scraped against the stone floor. Wait, those are... But the undead skeletons and ghouls were not his only problem. From holes in the tunnel walls, smaller spider-like creatures began to crawl out. Their bodies resembled spiders, but their heads were disturbingly humanoid with sharp teeth and empty eye sockets. They seemed connected to the monster he had just defeated, and perhaps the reason why these undead had started to reanimate.